She was 22 and frozen. No coat worth naming. No address. No one waiting. Just her father's canvas field pouch and $10 she had kept folded inside a bus schedule since the night the locks were changed. And with that $10, she bought a lapidary workshop, weather split and dust choked, on the north edge of Taos in Taos County. New Mexico, a place that had fallen off county maps in 1987. One back wall bowed outward like a tired rib. The roof leaked through 3 seams above the cutting room. The county had condemned it since 2009 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the oil-cooling reservoir of the cast-iron slab saw, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 30 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Ruby Marisol Vega had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. She had waited in doorways as a child, one hand on the warm metal knob, listening for the particular sound of peace in a house. Not laughter. Exactly. Laughter could turn sharp if somebody had been drinking, or if a bill came in the mail, or if her older sister found some new reason to look at Ruby as if she were a thing set down in the wrong room. Ruby listened instead for the calm between sounds, the scrape of a chair being pulled out carefully, the low clink of a spoon against a pot, her father humming with his mouth closed while he sorted rough stones on the kitchen table. They lived then in a narrow rental outside Espanola, where the winter light came in pale and sideways through aluminum-framed windows, and the chamisa bent silver in the wind. The house smelled of cumin, solder smoke, coffee gone bitter on the burner, and the faint mineral scent that followed her father home from job sites and trade fairs. He was not a jeweler in the way glossy magazines use the word. He made practical silver bracelets for tourists, repaired broken squash blossom necklaces, cut cabochons when somebody brought him decent turquoise, and accepted cash, food, or firewood depending on the season. Ruby learned early that money was not the first measure of a thing. A clasp could be honest or weak. Stone could be dyed or true. A person could smile and still be careless with what another person had made. Her mother, Elena, worked the early shift at a motel laundry, where sheets rolled through machines hot enough to raise steam in winter. She came home with red hands, folded herself into a chair, and took off her shoes without a word. In Ruby's youngest memory, her mother's hands were always doing something that looked like care. Folding, rinsing, plaiting hair, pressing a washcloth over a feverish forehead. But there was a part of Elena that had stepped backward long ago and never quite returned, as if some door inside her had closed softly and she had decided not to trouble the household by mentioning it. Ruby's father, Marisol Vega, was different. He could enter a room and lower the weather in it. He was not loud, and he had the sort of patience that made a child believe the world might be repaired if one only set the pieces in order. His hands were broad and dark from sun, his thumbnail on the right side flattened from a hammer strike years before, and he wore magnifying lenses on a cord around his neck like another man might wear a cross. On Saturdays, he took Ruby with him to his mother's place near Trucius, where the mountains rose blue and severe beyond the Pinon. Her grandmother had died before Ruby was old enough to remember her, but her father's uncle still lived there in a 2-room, adobe house with a corrugated tin roof, a cold spring, and a shed full of wheels, belts, grit, and stones wrapped in newspaper. His name was Ignacio Salazar, though everyone in the family called him Tio Nacho. He was not truly an uncle by blood in the neat way people drew trees on paper. He was a cousin, a widower, a godfather, a keeper of stories, and one of the last men in that part of the county who could look at a rough stone and tell where its best face was hiding. He had a silver beard that grew in 2 directions, a left eye clouded by cataract, and fingers so steady they seemed borrowed from a younger man. Ruby's weekend ritual began before sunrise. Mateo would wake her while the house still held the night, and he would lay 2 flour tortillas wrapped in a cloth beside her on the truck seat. The road north was dark except for the faint lamps of gas stations and the slow gold line growing behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Ruby would press her forehead to the cold window and watch fences, cottonwoods, and sleeping fields pass in gray pieces. By the time they reached Tio Nacho's shed, the first light would be touching the workbench. He kept the place orderly, though it did not look orderly to anyone who did not understand his method. Coffee cans held DOP sticks. Baby food jars held cerium oxide, tin oxide, and worn diamond burrs. Strips of leather hung from nails. A basin of cloudy water stood near the trim saw, and beside it lay a rag folded as carefully as a church linen. Against the far wall sat the heavy slab saw that had once belonged to a Taos cutter, its cast-iron frame painted a green so aged it had become almost black. Ruby was small enough then to believe machines had tempers. The slab saw seemed to her the most patient and dangerous thing in the room. It did not chatter like the trim saw or whine like the polishing wheel. It waited with a round blade half hidden under its guard, smelling of oil, metal, and stone dust. Tio Nacho never let her touch it without both his hands over hers. "Stone does not forgive a hurried hand," he told her one morning. He said it without drama, while guiding a piece of jasper toward the blade, the water and oil sliding over the cut in a gray shining thread. Ruby remembered that sentence because it did not seem to be only about stone. It was about eggs in a pan, stitches in a hem, a frightened animal, a sick parent, a person who had been wounded and would not say where. A hurried hand broke what a careful hand might reveal. After cutting, there was shaping. After shaping, sanding. After sanding, the long, slow polish that made Ruby impatient until she began to understand the work was not decoration but discovery. A stone could be dull for hours, stubborn for days, and then one morning under the wheel it would open into blue-green water. Red desert, milk cloud, black mountain, or a white line fine as breath. Tio Nacho taught her to use a light touch and to keep her thumbs away from the wheel. He taught her to feel heat through the DOP stick before the stone cracked. He taught her that turquoise needed respect, because soft beauty could be easier to ruin than hardness. At noon, they ate beans from a pot and tortillas warmed on the stove. Mateo and Tio Nacho spoke in a mixture of English and Spanish, the talk moving from roof repairs to silver prices to old families who had gone to Albuquerque or Phoenix and never come back. Ruby sat between them, drinking weak coffee with too much milk, watching dust move in the square of sunlight by the door. Those Saturdays were the first home she ever trusted. Then Mateo got sick in a way that did not announce itself all at once. He started losing weight. He sat down more often. His cough stayed after winter passed, and the lenses around his neck began resting against a chest that looked less and less able to hold breath. He kept working until the day his hand slipped while he was setting a bezel and the stone popped free, rolled across the table, and disappeared under the stove. By summer, he could no longer drive north. Tio Nacho came instead, in an old brown pickup with a cracked windshield, bringing small parcels wrapped in butcher paper. He would sit at Mateo's bedside and talk about nothing heavy. Weather, the price of propane, a woman in Taos who wanted old silver melted into new rings. Sometimes he opened one parcel and placed a stone in Mateo's palm, and the two men would study it as if the entire earth had been reduced to that single rough piece. Mateo died in October. When Ruby was 15, on a morning cold enough to frost the inside corners of the windows. There were casseroles for 3 days, murmured prayers, black clothes borrowed from neighbors, and then the ordinary cruelty of time returning with its lists and due dates. Elena stopped saying Mateo's name except when paperwork required it. Ruby's sister, Celeste, 17 then and already beautiful in a sharp, costly way, began wearing Mateo's silver rings as if grief were something that could be displayed and traded. Tio Nacho tried to keep the Saturdays alive. For almost 2 years, he came for Ruby twice a month and took her to the shed, where he had set aside a drawer for the things he said belonged to her hands. Her father's dop pot, a set of worn files, 3 pieces of Sleeping Beauty turquoise, 2 pieces of Royston ribbon, a cigar box filled with cabochons Mateo had cut and never sold, a little leather roll of gravers, silver black from age, a notebook with Mateo's measurements in pencil, written so exactly that Ruby could hear him breathing between the numbers. When Tio Nacho died of a stroke 2 weeks after Ruby turned 18, the drawer disappeared before the funeral ham was cold. No one admitted moving it. No one had seen the cigar box. No one knew where the leather roll had gone. Celeste shrugged in the kitchen, wearing lipstick the color of dried cherries, and said maybe old men threw things away without telling anyone. Elena stood by the sink with her hands in soapy water and did not lift her eyes. Ruby looked for those things for months. In closets, in the carport, behind sacks of winter clothes, under Celeste's bed when Celeste was gone, though she hated herself for it. She found pawn tickets once, folded inside a magazine, but the names were smudged by spilled soda and the dates had passed. By then the stones, if they were her father's, had gone into somebody else's tray, somebody else's ring, somebody else's careless story about where beautiful things came from. After that, the house changed its sound. Celeste grew restless in the way of someone who believed life had cheated her before she had been asked to do much with it. She had inherited Mateo's fine cheekbones, but none of his restraint. She could be tender with strangers and exacting at home, especially with Ruby, who worked at a grocery deli, took night classes when she could, and kept her paychecks in a bank envelope taped under a dresser drawer. Celeste borrowed first. Then she demanded. Then she took and made silence around the taking, daring anyone to name it. There were men who came and went. Not violent men, not men who broke furniture, but men who brought a dry chemical smell into the hallway and left the bathroom mirror dusted with a powder Ruby wiped away using toilet paper wrapped around her fingers. There were weeks when Celeste slept all day, and then moved through the house at 3 a.m. opening cabinets. There were apologies that arrived with tears and disappeared before rent was due. There were promises made on Mateo's grave, spoken with one hand pressed against Celeste's chest, as if the shape of sorrow could be borrowed for persuasion. Ruby learned not to argue. Arguing only made Elena fold smaller into herself. Ruby learned to hide money in different places and then learned that hiding was not enough. She learned which pawnshops asked for identification and which ones did not. She learned that a family could become a hallway where everyone passed one another carefully, carrying breakable things that had already cracked. The final winter came lean. The motel where Elena worked changed owners. Ruby's hours at the deli were cut after Thanksgiving. Celeste vanished for 6 days and returned with a bruise yellowing along her jaw, 3 plastic bags of clothes Ruby had never seen, and a smile too bright to be trusted. By then the rent was behind, and notices had begun appearing under the door in envelopes with red print. Ruby paid what she could. She sold her winter boots and wore thrift store shoes with cardboard inside. She stopped buying coffee. She carried a thermos of hot water and called it enough. On December 6, the landlord came before noon. He was a square man with kind eyes he had trained not to use. Ruby remembered that because he held the eviction packet in both hands, as though it were something hot, and because a snow flurry had started behind him, thin and dry, blowing sideways across the gravel lot. The object she kept seeing afterward was not the paper, not the lockbox he had brought for the new key, but the blue ceramic bowl on the kitchen table, the one Mateo had used for sorting stones. It sat empty in a square of winter light. Celeste stood by the refrigerator in a red sweater that had cost more than Ruby's weekly groceries. Elena stood beside the stove, wiping the same clean place with a dishcloth. Ruby had a canvas duffel open on the floor. Into it she put 2 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, underwear, her father's field pouch, a toothbrush, the bank envelope with what remained after rent, and a photograph of Mateo and Tio Nacho standing outside the shed, their shoulders touching, both of them squinting into the sun. She reached for the blue ceramic bowl. Celeste's hand closed over it first. "Take what fits. The rest stays with us." 8 words, spoken flatly, without heat. That was the mercy of it and the wound. Celeste did not shout. She did not need to. She had already emptied the drawer, already pawned the stones, already learned that their mother's silence was a room she could use. Ruby looked at Elena. Her mother did not shake her head. She did not nod. She did not say the bowl belonged to Mateo, and therefore to the daughter who had sat beside him, sorting chips of turquoise from dust. She rinsed the dishcloth once more, wrung it carefully over the sink, and hung it on the oven handle as if the small order of that act could excuse the larger disorder. Ruby let go. Outside, the landlord waited beside the steps. He did not rush her. The snow was not enough to cover anything, only enough to make the air visible. When Ruby stepped down with the duffel cutting into her shoulder, he turned his face away in a manner that tried to preserve her dignity and perhaps his own. Behind her, the door closed softly. Then came the sound of the lock changing. She had $143 in cash, a bus pass with 2 rides left, and no address to write on job applications. For 6 weeks, she moved through northern New Mexico like a person trying not to leave footprints. The first 3 nights she slept in the lobby of an all-night laundromat in Espanola, sitting upright beside dryers that turned and turned, warming other people's blankets. A woman with silver hair and a cowboy sweatshirt let her stay after closing when the wind came hard, but only once, because rules were rules and kindness had to keep its job. Ruby bought a thrift store coat in Santa Fe for $18. It was too wide through the shoulders and missing 2 buttons, but it had deep pockets and smelled faintly of cedar. She slept one night in the chapel vestibule of a hospital, where a nurse placed a cup of broth beside her without asking a question. She slept another night under the covered portal near the palace of the governors, curled behind a stone bench while vendors' tables stood empty around her like patient witnesses. Her money diminished in exact, remembered amounts. $12 for the bus from Espanola to Santa Fe, $3.89 for a pack of tortillas, $7 for second-hand gloves with 1 torn seam, $2.25 for a locker at the transit center until the attendant said she could not keep using it like a room, $5 for a shower at a truck stop outside Bernalillo, where she washed her hair twice and watched gray water run toward the drain as though it were carrying away more than dirt. She went to Albuquerque because cities were supposed to hold opportunities, but the city in January held wind. It came down Central Avenue with grit in it, pushed napkins against chain-link fences, and lifted the edges of cardboard signs. Ruby filled out applications at diners, nursing homes, a discount store, and a warehouse that wanted a permanent address. She wrote her mother's old address once, then crossed it out so hard the paper tore. At night she found places that were almost shelter, A bus station seat beneath a broken vent. A women's shelter cot for 3 nights until the line grew longer than the beds. The back pew of a church during an evening warming program, where volunteers served soup in foam bowls and called everyone honey. The waiting room of a clinic until a security guard touched her shoulder with 2 fingers and said he was sorry. She kept the field pouch under her coat, tied by its strap to her wrist when she slept. Inside were the $10 bill she refused to spend, the photograph, a stub of pencil, and 1 small piece of red jasper Tio Nacho had once given her as practice. It was not valuable. It had a flawed edge and a dull polish, but it fit into the hollow below her thumb as if shaped for that purpose. Sometimes she held it while standing in line, not for luck, but for memory. Memory was steadier. By the 5th week, Ruby had stopped expecting rescue and had begun making terms with the day directly in front of her. She rose before the shelter lights came on. She washed in library bathrooms. She read bulletin boards carefully. She learned which grocery stores marked down bread in the evening and which clerks pretended not to notice when she counted pennies twice. Her coat grew shiny at the cuffs. Her shoes softened dangerously at the soles. The cardboard inside them became damp whenever snowmelt crossed the curb. On a Tuesday morning in Taos, she entered the public library because her fingers had gone numb and because the building had heat. She had reached Taos by taking a ride from a woman delivering medical supplies, then walking the last miles along a road where sagebrush stood dark against the snow. The library was low and warm, with Vegas overhead and children's drawings taped near the entrance. Ruby sat first in a chair by the magazines, letting feeling return painfully to her hands. Then she moved to the community bulletin board, because habit had become a kind of prayer. There were yoga classes, lost dogs, firewood for sale, rooms wanted, rooms offered, a notice about a free tax clinic, and 3 advertisements for house cleaning. Near the bottom, pinned crookedly with a green thumbtack, was a county notice printed on thin paper. Condemned commercial property. Former lapidary and silver workshop. North edge of Taos. Unsafe structure. Tax arrears satisfied by private transfer. Buyer assumes all liability. Sale price, $10. The ad had been stamped twice. Once by the county, once with the word final in fading red ink. Ruby read it 3 times. Not because she believed in miracles, but because the words lapidary and silver had struck some buried bell inside her chest, and the sound of it moved outward through her hands before the rest of her could answer. She leaned closer. The address was handwritten below the notice in blue ink, along with the clerk's office hours and a warning that the property had no active utilities. She copied the information onto the back of an overdue book slip, with a stub of pencil from the field pouch. Her handwriting came out too careful. Each number exact. Each letter made as if an error might close the door before she reached it. $10. She touched the bill through the canvas without removing it. The money had survived hunger because she had assigned it no purpose except not disappearing. It was the last part of her life not converted into bus fare, bread, or heat. She had kept it so long that spending it felt less like buying than surrendering. Yet the notice stayed there, plain and indifferent, offering no comfort and no promise. Only a ruined place. Only liability. Only the name of a trade that had once filled her Saturdays with dust, light, and patient hands. Ruby left the library at 2 in the afternoon with the address folded inside the photograph of Mateo and Tio Nacho. The sky had cleared, and the cold had sharpened. Snow lay in shaded places along the road, hard as salt. She walked to the county building, because the buses did not run where she needed them to run, and because waiting had never kept her warm. At a grocery entrance, she stopped and used the restroom, then stood under the hand dryer until a woman gave her a look that was not cruel, only tired. Outside again, Ruby adjusted the duffel across her shoulder and began counting blocks. She was not choosing a future. That would have been too large a thing, too bright and false for a day when her stomach was nearly empty and the wind had found the tear in her glove. She was choosing the next door. She was choosing to place $10 on a counter and ask whether a condemned room with a broken roof could legally become hers before the county tore it down. The building waited somewhere beyond the last good sidewalk, beyond the houses with smoke rising cleanly from their chimneys, beyond the places where people had names on mailboxes and keys that still fit. Ruby walked toward it with her father's pouch under her coat, not knowing that the heaviest machine in that forgotten workshop had been keeping its silence longer than she had been alive. By the time Ruby reached Paseo del Pueblo Norte, the afternoon had gone hard and bright, with the mountains standing blue beyond town as if they had been cut from colder stone. She had ridden north that morning in the back seat of a county bus that smelled of wet wool, diesel, and paper coffee cups left in the floor wells. The driver was a woman with silver rings on 3 fingers and a rosary looped over the gear shift. She did not speak much, but when Ruby asked how far the county offices were from the stop, the driver glanced at the duffel, then at Ruby's shoes, and told her to stay aboard 2 extra blocks. "Wind's mean today," she said. Ruby thanked her and took the seat behind the yellow line, hands folded over the canvas pouch beneath her coat. Outside the bus windows, the land opened and closed in careful bands, snow in the ditches, red earth under the snow, sage flattened by wind, fences leaning toward nothing in particular. At Espanola the air had been cold. Near Taos it had become exact, a knife made of distance and light. The ride ended near a gas station with a faded mural of mountains on one wall and a payphone with no receiver. Ruby stepped down into a temperature the bank sign called 26 degrees, though the wind made that number feel like an act of optimism. Her duffel strap had rubbed a raw place into the slope of her shoulder. She shifted it to the other side and began walking. She did not reach the county building that day. The office closed at 4:30, and she arrived at the locked glass doors after 5, breath showing white in the darkening air. A paper sign taped inside announced hours in neat black letters. Beyond it, the lobby stood lit and empty, with a floor so clean it reflected the fluorescent tubes overhead. Ruby looked at her own reflection in the glass, coat too large, hair pulled back with a rubber band, cheeks wind-burned, eyes fixed on a room she could not enter. She stood there longer than was useful. Then she turned away. There were still miles between her and any place that would allow her to sleep without being asked to move along. She had spent the last of her loose coins on a gas station packet of crackers and a paper cup of hot water, and she drank the water slowly, feeling it loosen something in her throat. A man in a wool hat watched her from beside the ice machine, not unkindly, but with the guarded attention people gave to strangers carrying everything they owned. At the edge of town, beyond a row of rental cabins closed for the season, she found a hay barn behind a locked gate. The gate was chained, but one strand of the fence had sagged near the arroyo, and a person small enough, tired enough, and careful enough could pass through without making much sound. Ruby did not disturb the stacked hay. She found a hollow behind a broken feed trough where the wind came through less directly, spread one shirt beneath her shoulders, and used the duffel as a pillow. The temperature dropped to 19 before midnight. She knew because she woke often and looked at the weathered thermometer nailed to a post 10 feet away, its red line shrinking lower each time the moon moved. The barn smelled of dust, old alfalfa, mice, and dry manure. Somewhere in the dark, a horse shifted in another enclosure, hooves thudding once, then settling. Ruby put her hands under her arms. She counted slowly to keep from clenching her teeth. When her feet began to ache with cold, she stood and walked in place for 10 minutes, then lay down again and listened to the roof tick under frost. Near dawn, a rooster called from a property across the road. Ruby rose in stages, as if her joints belonged to someone older. Her coat was stiff with cold. Her breath had dampened the inside of her collar, and the torn seam of her glove had widened. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her shirt, stepped out of the barn as the eastern sky paled, and followed the road back toward town. Taos received her without ceremony. The streets were waking slowly. A bakery called Blue Corn Hearth had its lights on, and a man in a white apron was carrying trays behind steamed glass. Next door, Marisol's cafe had chairs still upside down on tables and a chalkboard promising green child stew. Across the street, Medina Hardware displayed snow shovels, stovepipe, kerosene cans, and a stack of 50-pound bags of ice melt behind its front windows. Farther down stood a pawn and repair shop with barred glass and 3 violins hanging above a case of silver rings. Near the plaza, a laundromat called Morning Star Wash had a blue neon sign flickering in one corner, and beside it, a narrow bookstore had paperbacks in the window, their spines bleached by years of sun. Ruby looked at all of it carefully, not as a tourist would look, but as a person measuring what might later become necessary. Food, heat, tools, a public restroom, a place to read notices when her hands stopped shaking, a place where someone might need a floor swept or windows washed. The county clerk's office opened at 8. Ruby arrived at 7:40 and sat on a bench under a cottonwood that had lost all its leaves. The building was adobe-colored, with a flat roof and a flag snapping above the entrance. Trucks came and went. A woman with a briefcase hurried past, smelling of hairspray and cold perfume. 2 men in work jackets carried rolled survey maps between them and stamped snow from their boots before going inside. Ruby waited until the minute hand on the clock above the door reached 12. Then she stood, smoothed her coat as well as she could, and entered. Heat struck her face first. Then the smell of paper, floor wax, toner, and somebody's breakfast burrito wrapped in foil. The lobby held 3 counters behind thick glass, a row of plastic chairs, and a bulletin board with maps, meeting notices, and announcements about septic permits. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A vending machine clicked softly in the corner. Filled with candy bars Ruby did not look at for long. At the center window sat a clerk with a narrow face, silver hair cut at her jaw, and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain. Her sweater was the color of dried sage, and her hands were small, square, and busy. On the counter before her stood a brass nameplate that had been polished around the letters but not inside them. MRS. Adeline Quintana, Stankenty clerk. She did not glance up immediately. She finished aligning a stack of papers, tapped them twice against the desk, placed them into a folder, and then raised her eyes. Yes? Ruby stepped closer. Her voice had gone rough from the night air. I came about the condemned workshop notice. Mrs. Quintana looked at her for 1 second, then another. Not rudely. Not warmly. Precisely. Her gaze took in the duffel. The worn coat, the cracked lips, the shoulders braced against a judgment Ruby had not yet heard. Then she reached for a file drawer without asking which notice. That, more than anything, told Ruby how few people had asked before her. The Lapidary property, the clerk said. Yes. Mom. Mrs. Quintana withdrew a folder thick with forms and thin with hope. She opened it on the counter and turned 3 pages, each one stamped with warnings. Measurements, parcels, taxes. and signatures from people who had considered the building only long enough to decide it was not worth saving. You understand this is not a residence? Yes. Mom. You understand it has no certified water service? Yes. Mom. No active electrical account? Yes. Mom. The roof has failed in more than one place? Yes. Mom. The county inspector marked the rear wall as structurally unsound? Yes. Mom. Mrs. Quintana paused and touched the edge of one page with the tip of her finger. Her fingernail was cut close and painted clear. You understand that if you sign this, the county is not responsible for injury, loss, weather damage, theft, fire, illness, or the expense of bringing the structure back within code. Ruby looked down at the paper. The language was stern but not complicated. She had learned that official sentences often said simple things in iron clothes. Yes. Mom. The clerk leaned back a little. And you understand there is no refund? Ruby's hand moved inside her coat until her fingers closed around the folded bill in the canvas pouch. For a moment she kept it there, feeling the softened paper, the crease worn into it from weeks of being pressed against the photograph. Then she brought it out. I understand, Mrs. Quintana did not take the money immediately. She looked at Ruby's hand, at the torn glove, at the bill flattened on the counter. It had been folded and refolded until the face printed on it had worn pale along the center. You are certain? It was not exactly a question. Ruby answered it anyway. Yes. Mom. The clerk breathed in through her nose, not a sigh, but something close to it. She lifted the bill, smoothed it once with her palm, and placed it in a shallow drawer beneath the counter. Then she turned to the forms. The process took 47 minutes. Ruby printed her name in boxes, initialed beside warnings, signed below a paragraph stating she accepted the property as is, where is, with all visible and hidden defects. The pen was chained to the counter, and the chain clicked softly each time she moved her hand. Her fingers were still stiff, making the letters slower than usual, but she wrote them carefully. Mrs. Quintana copied identification from the one card Ruby still had and looked only once at the expired address. When the final page was signed, the clerk reached for a brass stamp on the back desk. It had a wooden handle darkened by years of hands. She aligned the document with care and pressed down. The sound was firm, final, and strangely intimate. Not loud, only exact. Mrs. Quintana made 2 copies. One she placed in the county file. One she slid through the opening beneath the glass, along with a small envelope containing a key so dark with age it looked more brown than silver. Front padlock, she said. May not work. Chain may need cutting. Ruby accepted the envelope with both hands. The clerk pulled a map from beneath the counter and marked it with a yellow pencil. You will go north out of town, past the cemetery road, then take Upper Ranchitos until the pavement breaks. There's a ditch on the left, then 2 walnut trees. If you reach the trailer with the blue door, you've gone too far. The workshop sits back from the road behind a low wall. The sign is still there, unless wind finally took it. Ruby folded the map along its old creases. Thank you. Mrs. Quintana did not let go of the other paper right away. Her eyes had moved to the line where Ruby had written her last name. Something altered in her face, very slightly. The official expression remained, but the woman behind it had leaned nearer. Vega, she said. Ruby looked up. Yes. Mom. You related to Mateo Vega? The sound of her father's name in that heated office made the room narrow for a moment. Ruby's hand tightened around the envelope. She had not expected anyone here to know him. Not in this building. Not on this morning. Not from across a counter where every other word had been liability. He was my father. Mrs. Quintana's gaze lowered, and she set the paper down with more care than before. He repaired my mother's bracelet once. Silver cuff. Greenstone, cracked at the edge. She would not let anybody else touch it. She paused. He brought it back better than it had been. Ruby did not answer at once. The hum of the light seemed louder. He was careful, she said. Mrs. Quintana nodded, and the nod held more than agreement. It held recognition of a kind that asked for no story and offered no pity. There was an older man with him sometimes, the clerk said. Clouded eye. Hands like a surgeon. Ruby looked toward the map because looking at the clerk had become difficult. Yeah, he filed a trade permit here years ago for a cooperative that never opened. Lapidary, silver repair, instructional classes, Mrs. Quintana rested one finger on the folder. Same road. Not the same parcel, but close. Ruby read the yellow line on the map again, though it had blurred slightly. I did not know that. A lot of things around here were almost something. The clerk's voice softened without losing its plainness. Then the 80s ended. Leases changed. People moved. Roofs failed. Files stayed. The sentence settled between them. Mrs. Quintana pulled one more sheet from a side drawer, wrote a phone number in the corner, and slid it over. This is the non-emergency line for the sheriff's office. If someone is on the property, you call. Do not argue. Do not go inside if you smell gas, though there should not be any service left to smell. And if the front room ceiling looks wet, do not sleep under it. Yes. Mom! The clerk studied her again, less like an official now, and more like a woman deciding how much she was allowed to care. There's a cafe 2 blocks over. Marisol gives yesterday's rolls to people who ask before 10. Ruby's face warmed. I will remember. You do that, Mrs. Quintana slid the last page through. And Miss Vega. Ruby paused with the map half-folded. Keep your deed. The wind had strengthened by the time she returned to the street. She did not go to the cafe. Pride was part of it, but not all. She had eaten shame in too many forms lately, and she wanted to reach the place she had bought before accepting another person's mercy. She put the deed inside the field pouch, beneath the photograph, and tucked the map into her coat pocket. Then she began walking north. Upper Ranchitos Road carried her away from the fuller streets by degrees. First came houses with carved gates and blue doors, galleries closed for winter, a massage studio with a wind chime made of spoons, and a dentist office shaped like an adobe chapel. Then the road loosened. Mailboxes leaned at different angles. Dogs announced her from behind fences with the deep confidence of animals who knew exactly where they belonged. At one property, a black and white dog followed along the fence line for 100 yards, barking until Ruby looked at him directly. I do not have anything, she said. The dog wagged once, as if that were an acceptable answer, and trotted back toward a porch where firewood was stacked to the eaves. The pavement grew cracked, then broken. Snow lay in the shade of junipers. The ditch beside the road was lined with ice thin enough to show slow water moving underneath, dark and deliberate. A pickup passed once, the driver lifting 2 fingers from the steering wheel. Ruby lifted her hand back. The gesture felt almost like belonging, though she did not trust it enough to name it. She passed the cemetery road. White crosses stood inside a low wall, some leaning, some garlanded with plastic flowers bright against winter. A raven sat on the top of a gate and watched her without moving. Beyond the cemetery, the houses grew farther apart. Smoke rose from one chimney and bent flat in the wind. The mountains seemed closer here, not because they had moved, but because there were fewer things pretending to stand between them and the human life below. The duffel had become a weight with opinions. It pulled at her spine. Her right foot had blistered along the heel, and every step pressed the torn skin against damp cardboard. She stopped once beside a fence and drank from a bottle she had filled in the library bathroom. The water was so cold it hurt her teeth. 2 walnut trees appeared after a bend. They stood leafless on either side of a low stone wall, their branches black and spreading, their trunks twisted by weather and age. Between them, set back from the road, was the workshop. For a few moments, Ruby did not move. The building was longer than she expected and lower, built of adobe in the front and patch frame construction in the back, as if one generation had begun it and another had kept adding what it could afford. The front measured perhaps 26 feet across, with a shallow porch roof sagging over a door that had once been painted turquoise. The color remained only in protected places, under the hardware and along the inner seams, where sun and sand had not taken it. 2 front windows stared out with one pane cracked and the other clouded by dust. The roof was corrugated metal, rusted along its seams, held down in places by stones and 2 lengths of pipe. A small chimney rose on the left side, missing 3 bricks at the crown. The sign hung crooked above the porch. Salazar and Vega, stone cutting, silver repair. The letters were nearly gone. Weather had eaten the paint until the names emerged and disappeared depending on where Ruby stood. Yet she saw them. She saw the second name and had to take 1 step backward, as if the ground had shifted under her. The wind moved through dry grass at the base of the wall. She did not know whether her father had ever stood here. She did not know whether the sign had meant his hands, his hope, his temporary labor, or only a friendship old enough to be painted onto cedar and left for weather. The county file had not told her. The notice had not told her. The clerk had only given her the thread. Ruby crossed the gap in the wall and walked to the porch. The boards complained beneath her weight. One had rotted at the edge, and she stepped over it carefully. The padlock on the front chain was red with rust. The key entered halfway, stopped, and would not turn. She tried again, slowly, listening to the metal. Tio Nacho had once told her that force was only another way of being deaf. She took the key out, breathed warm air into the lock, wiped it with the hem of her coat, and tried once more. This time it turned. The chain fell against the door with a sound that seemed too large for such a narrow place. Ruby lifted it away and pushed. The door resisted at first, swollen by weather. Then it gave inward with a long scraping sigh. The smell came out first. Cold dust, dry wood, mouse droppings, oil gone rancid, mineral powder, rust, and old ash. Beneath those odors lay something else, faint and stubborn, the smell of stone under water. Ruby stood at the threshold until her eyes adjusted. The front room was dim. Light entered through dirty windows and broken seams in the roof, falling in pale shafts that revealed dust hanging motionless in the air. To the right stood a counter with a glass display case beneath it, empty except for a curled strip of velvet and 2 dead flies. Behind the counter, shelves climbed the wall, some still holding paper envelopes labeled in faded pencil, agate, jasper, scrap silver, findings, dop wax. A stool lay on its side near the corner. A calendar from 1991 hung crooked on a nail, Open to April, the picture showing shiprock under a violet sky. On the left side of the room sat a pot-bellied stove with one door hanging loose. Beside it were 3 split logs so dry they had silvered at the ends. A broom with no handle leaned against the wall. The floor was not level, but it held. Ruby tested each step before trusting it, learning at once that the boards near the counter dipped, while those by the stove were stronger. The air was colder inside than out. She closed the door behind her to stop the wind, and the room darkened. For a few seconds the silence pressed close around her ears. Then she began to hear the building. A tick in the roof metal, a faint skitter inside one wall. Water dripping somewhere far back. Not fast, not steady, but persistent enough to matter. She moved toward the rear doorway. The back room was the cutting room. It had a higher ceiling, exposed rafters, and a concrete floor coated in decades of gray-green dust. There were workbenches along 2 walls, their surfaces scarred by saw marks, burns, and circular stains where cans had once stood. A trim saw sat under a torn tarp. 2 polishing wheels, belts slack and cracked, faced a window so dirty it admitted light only as a brown haze. Silver bench occupied the far corner, complete with a fire brick soldering pad, a rusted vise, and a little drawer unit with half its pulls missing. And in the center, patient as an animal too heavy to move, stood the slab saw. It was larger than the one Ruby remembered, or perhaps memory had made the old machine smaller. This one had a cast iron frame, a blade housing wide as a barrel, and a sliding carriage built to hold stone that could not be lifted by one person without consequences. Its paint had darkened almost to black. A manufacturer's plate on the side read Highland Park, Los Angeles, though the screws were so rusted the letters seemed to be sinking back into metal. Below the carriage sat the oil-cooling reservoir, capped by a rectangular lid crusted at the edges with dried sludge and dust. Ruby did not go near it at first. There were more immediate things. A roof that leaked. A stove that might or might not draw. Windows that did not keep out wind. A floor that could hold her in one room and betray her in another. Light was already leaving the back window, and she had learned enough from hard weeks to know that darkness made every task larger. She returned to the front room and set her duffel near the stove, away from the ceiling stain misses. Quintana had warned her about. From the 3 logs beside the stove, she selected the smallest and tried to open the stove door fully. It fell off into her hands. She stood holding it, soot rubbing black across her palms, and looked down at the little iron mouth. "All right," she said. Her voice sounded unfamiliar indoors. There was no kindling, but in the display case she found brittle envelopes, a stack of old sales slips, and a cardboard jewelry box with the cotton lining chewed by mice. She tore the paper into strips. In the back room she found a rusted coffee can holding curls of wood shaved from some old repair. She carried them carefully, as if they were a meal. The chimney might be blocked. The stove might smoke. The building might be too far gone to warm. She knew all of that. Still, the evening had entered the room, and cold was no longer a condition. It was an animal. Ruby opened the damper with effort, arranged paper and shavings, struck one of her last matches, and shielded the flame with both hands. The paper caught, then faltered, then took. The shavings lit with a soft, eager sound. Smoke lifted, hesitated, and pushed into the room. Ruby coughed and reached for the stove door, holding it in place with one foot while the pipe decided whether to draw. For a long minute, the smoke thickened. Then something shifted above. The draft caught. The thin flame leaned inward and rose. The first log blackened, then opened a red seam along one edge. Ruby stayed crouched before it until her knees hurt, feeding paper one strip at a time, not trusting the fire to live without witness. When it held, she sat back on the floor and rubbed soot from her fingers with the inside of her sleeve. There was no food except 2 tortillas folded in wax paper and half a packet of crackers. She warmed the tortillas on a scrap of foil laid across the stovetop, turning them with bare fingers because there was no utensil clean enough to use. The smell of warm corn filled the room. She ate slowly, though hunger urged otherwise, and saved half of 1 tortilla for morning. Outside, the wind moved against the walls. Inside, the fire made a dim orange window in the stove. Ruby dragged the duffel close, put on both shirts from inside it, wrapped the spare pair of jeans around her feet, and lay down on the floorboards between the counter and the stove, where the roof did not appear to leak and the boards seemed sound. From that low place, the workshop looked different. The shelves rose above her like cliffs. The cracked display glass caught firelight and held it in narrow lines. The sign outside creaked once, metal against wood, and the building answered in its beams. Somewhere in the back room, a drop of water fell into a pan or a can with a hollow sound. Ruby turned the envelope with the deed beneath her cheek, inside the field pouch, so her body would keep it dry. Sleep did not come quickly. It approached and retreated. Each time she neared it, some sound lifted her back, the stove settling, a mouse in the wall, wind at the door, a soft tap from the roof where loosened metal moved. But none of those sounds asked her to leave. None belonged to a landlord, a security guard, a sister's closed hand, a mother's lowered eyes. Near midnight, the fire sank into coals. The room cooled but did not freeze. Ruby opened her eyes to the dark shape of the counter, the shelves, the crooked calendar, and the front window clouded by dust and stars. She had paid for ruin. That was true. She had also paid for a door that closed from the inside. The workshop was patient. So was she. Morning made the workshop less merciful and more useful. Ruby woke with her cheek against the canvas pouch, and one hand closed around the edge of the deed, though the paper was safe beneath the cloth. The fire had gone out sometime before dawn, leaving a powdery hill of ash in the pot-bellied stove and a smell like cold pennies. Light entered through the front windows in 2 blunt rectangles, showing what the night had softened, the dust, the mouse tracks, the stain spreading under the ceiling seam, the strip of sky visible through a lifted piece of roof metal. She did not rise quickly. She lay still long enough to listen. The building had a morning voice. The roof ticked as frost left it. A board near the counter gave a small settling sound. In the back room, the drip she had heard the night before continued at uneven intervals, the water striking something metal with the patience of a clock that had lost its numbers. Outside, a raven called once from the walnut tree, and then there was only wind pushing along the wall. Ruby folded the spare jeans, shook dust from them, and put them back in the duffel. Her fingers were stiff, but they worked. That seemed enough to begin with. The first 3 days were not heroic. They were made of finding what did not work and learning how not to make it worse. There was no well pump behind the shop, only an iron hand pump beside the rear wall, its handle frozen at the joint and its spout wrapped in a rag long since chewed open by weather. Ruby spent half an hour on the first morning clearing dead grass and ice from around its base. She pressed the handle down with both hands. It moved 1 inch, screamed metal against metal, and stopped. She tried again with less force, then left it alone because she could hear Tio Nacho's old warning in the resistance itself. Tools told you when you were about to break them. At the far end of the yard, beyond a patch of rabbit brush and a sunken pile of lumber, She found the outhouse. Its door hung from one hinge. Snow had blown through the crescent cutout and settled in a slant across the seat. A wasp nest, abandoned and gray as paper ash, clung to the ceiling. Ruby stood in the doorway with her scarf pulled over her nose and considered the facts without flinching. Then she found a broken shovel near the back steps, cleared the snow, knocked down the wasp nest with the handle, and wedged a flat stone under the door to keep it from swinging open. It was not dignity. Exactly. It was privacy, and privacy was close enough. Water came from town at first. Twice a day, she walked to the public library with 2 empty plastic jugs she had found under the front counter, rinsed them in the restroom sink until the water ran clear, and filled them slowly so the librarian would not hear the pipes hammering. On the second afternoon, the librarian, a broad woman with gray braids and red reading glasses, looked at the jugs, then at Ruby's coat, then returned to stamping books without comment. Beside Ruby's hand on the counter, she placed a flyer for public assistance, face down, so no one else in line would see it. Ruby took it. She did not yet know whether she would use it, but she folded it carefully and kept it dry. Inside the workshop, she learned the floor's language. The front room had 11 safe steps from door to stove, 8 from stove to counter, and 4 she did not trust near the left window where water had softened the boards. She marked the bad places with strips of masking tape found in a drawer, though the tape no longer stuck well and had to be weighted at the corners with pebbles. The back room's concrete floor was sound except where old oil had made one patch slick. She scattered dust over it until her shoes found traction. Each night she moved her sleeping place by inches, guided by the roof. On the first night after the deed, water dropped into a pan she placed under the seam. On the second, wind lifted the metal with such force that she rose in the dark and sat beside the stove, ready to move if the roof opened. On the third, snow came briefly, not enough to cover the road, only enough to dust the walnut branches and show where animals had crossed the yard before dawn. She spent those days clearing only what had to be cleared. She did not begin with memory or sentiment. She began with breath. The chimney mattered first. If the stove could not draw cleanly, she could not sleep inside safely. If she could not sleep inside, the deed was only paper, and the shop was only a different kind of weather. She studied the pipe from below, then went outside and looked up at the chimney crown. 3 bricks were missing, and the remaining mortar had crumbled into pale sand at the joints. Black stains feathered the brick below the cap, showing years of smoke, rain, and neglect. She needed a brush, stove cement, gloves that did not have a torn seam, a bucket, a hand broom, and advice that cost less than pride. On the 4th morning, Ruby walked back into town and entered Medina Hardware just after the bell over the door rang 9. The store was deeper than it looked from the street, with narrow aisles running between shelves that carried everything from mason jars to pipe fittings. The air smelled of cedar shims, rubber boots, coffee, seed packets, machine oil, and the mineral dust tracked in by people who worked with their hands. Above the counter hung sleds, rope, extension cords, and 3 old snowshoes. A black cat slept in a box of discounted work gloves, its tail hanging over a cardboard sign that read irregulars. Behind the register stood a man in his 70s with one hearing aid, a white mustache trimmed square, and suspenders the color of faded maroon. His hair had thinned on top but remained thick over the ears. He wore a flannel shirt buttoned to the throat and a pencil tucked behind his right ear. When Ruby approached, he was repairing the torn paper cover of an inventory ledger with clear tape, smoothing it with the side of his thumb. He looked up once and did not smile too soon. What are you needing? Ruby had written the list on the back of a county envelope. She unfolded it and set it on the counter. I need to clean a stove chimney. Small pot-belly stove. Old pipe. I do not know whether the flue is blocked. The man leaned over the list without touching it. You got roof access? Not safe access. Ladder? No. Sir. He nodded as if this confirmed something he had expected of the day. Which place? Ruby hesitated. Old Stone and Silver Shop. North edge of town. The man's eyes moved from the list to her face. He did not ask how she had come by it. He did not ask whether she understood what she had taken on. Perhaps everyone who had lived long enough in a hard place knew that understanding often came after the signature. That chimney is short, he said. If the clean-out ain't rusted shut, you can do most from below. Ruby looked down at the counter. I do not know where the clean-out is. Then you need more than a brush. He left the register and walked with the careful balance of a man whose knees had made private arrangements with pain. From a back shelf he gathered a 6-inch round poly chimney brush, 3 flexible fiberglass rods, a small tub of black furnace cement, a wire hand brush, a cheap dust mask, leather gloves from the irregular box, a flashlight, and a dented galvanized bucket whose price tag had been crossed out twice. At the counter he laid the items in a row and wrote each amount on a paper pad. Brush, $11.95. Rods, $9 for the set. Cement, $4.79. Wire brush, $2.15. Dust mask, 99 cents. Gloves, $3 because the left thumb stitched crooked. Flashlight, $6.50. Bucket, $2. Ruby watched the numbers form. Together they were more than she could spend. I will take the brush and rods, she said. The man capped his pen. You'll take the mask, too, unless you want creosote in your lungs. She looked at the coins and bills in her palm. The money had become painfully specific. There was enough for part of the list, not the whole of it, and no honest arithmetic could make otherwise. I can come back for the rest. You got... Not yet. You got a... Ruby Vega. The pencil behind his ear came down slowly. The man looked at her again, and this time the name seemed to reach some shelf in him that had held dust for a long while. I'm Henry Medina, he said. Your father sharpened my wife's turquoise ring when the stone chipped. Wouldn't take enough money for it. Ruby did not know what to do with that sentence. Gratitude came too quickly and had nowhere to stand, so she kept her hands still. He did that sometimes, she said. Henry looked at the items on the counter. Then he took a carbon receipt book from beneath the register and opened it to a blank page. I can run a store account for repairs that keep you alive and dry. Not for candy. Not for notions. Not for foolishness. You come in every Friday and tell me where you are with it. When you get paid, you pay something. $1 counts if it comes when promised. Ruby swallowed once. I do not know when I will get paid. Then you tell me that on Friday. He wrote her name at the top of the receipt. His handwriting was blocky and exact. I cannot take charity, she said. Henry snorted, not unkindly. Credit ain't charity. It's a rope. You can climb with it or hang yourself. I'm offering the first. He placed the dust mask beside the brush. Do you know how to clean from below? No, sir. He reached beneath the counter and pulled out a stapled booklet with a sun-faded cover, Home Heat Safety, Wood Stoves, Chimneys, and Flues. The corners were curled, and a coffee ring stained the first page. Old extension office manual, he said. Free, because nobody reads. Ruby accepted it with the sort of care people used for glass. You read the chimney section twice before you strike another match. You lay a tarp if you got one. If not, wet newspaper around the stove mouth. You brush upward in sections. Turn clockwise. Don't jam. Don't breathe what falls. You find the cleanout if there is one. And if you hear anything alive in there, you stop. Yes, sir. Henry tore off the receipt and pushed it toward her. The total, written at the bottom, was $41.38. He did not ask for anything that morning. Ruby carried the supplies back along upper ranchitos with the rods balanced over one shoulder and the bucket knocking against her leg. The wind had lessened, and the sun had begun to soften the ice along the ditch. A truck slowed once, and a woman inside asked if she needed a ride. Ruby said no before she could think better of it, then regretted the answer for half a mile. Pride, she was learning, could waste calories. At the workshop, she set the supplies on the floor and read the manual beside the front window, where light was strongest. The booklet was plain and practical, with drawings of stovepipe angles, chimney caps, draft paths, and a diagram of glazed creosote that looked like black coral. She read the chimney section once, then again aloud in a low voice, because spoken instructions seemed to enter her hands more directly. Before beginning, she prepared as if the room deserved care. She emptied the stove, scooping ash into the bucket with a flattened coffee can. She spread old sales slips and envelopes in a wide half-circle around the stove door, then dampened them with water from one jug so falling soot would not rise so easily. She tied a bandana over her hair, put on the crooked gloves, and fitted the dust mask over her mouth and nose. The first pipe joint resisted. She worked the screws with a rusted screwdriver found in the silver bench drawer, pressing steadily so she would not strip them. One screw came free. The second broke. The third turned after she tapped the handle with the heel of her palm. When the elbow pipe loosened, a dry black shower fell onto the damp papers, and with it came the smell of old smoke concentrated into something bitter and almost sweet. Ruby waited for the dust to settle. Then she began. The brush entered the pipe awkwardly at first, its bristles catching on rough metal. She added one fiberglass rod, then another, turning clockwise as Henry had told her, pushing upward with a motion that required her shoulders, back, and knees. Soot fell in waves. Creosote flakes struck the stove bottom like broken shells. After the first hour, her arms trembled. After the second, sweat had cooled under her shirt, and her hands smelled of leather, ash, and iron. She stopped every 15 minutes to let the dust settle and to breathe near the cracked front window. She cleaned the pipe elbow with the wire brush until the metal showed through in dull patches. She found the cleanout behind the stove, a little square plate painted shut by old soot and time. It took the edge of a chisel and 20 minutes of careful persuasion to open it. Behind it lay a packed mass of creosote, bird nest, and something that might once have been leaves. No living thing emerged. She worked until the light thinned and the back of her neck ached. The manual had said a proper cleaning could take an hour. The manual had not been written for a condemned workshop whose chimney had swallowed 3 decades of weather and neglect. Ruby brushed, scraped, emptied, and brushed again. By the 4th hour, the bucket held enough black debris to make the room smell like a burned house. By the 5th, the brush passed upward with less resistance. By the 6th, she could shine the flashlight into the cleanout and see a narrow gray tunnel rising where there had been only darkness. She washed her hands outside with water so cold it turned her knuckles red. Ash clung beneath her nails. Her arms felt loosened from their sockets. Before relighting the stove, she went into the yard and looked up at the chimney. The missing brick still mattered. The crown still needed repair. But when she opened the stove damper and held a match near the pipe, the flame leaned inward. That was enough for one night. The first clean fire began small. A twist of paper, 3 curls of dry shaving, a split of silvered wood cut thin with a dull hatchet she found under the counter. Ruby gave the flame time to take, then closed the stove door as far as its broken hinge allowed. No smoke pushed into the room. The fire breathed upward, and within 20 minutes the pipe began to click with heat. Ruby sat on the floor and held both hands toward the stove, palms blackened and fingers spread. For supper she made what she had: half a tortilla, broken crackers, and a little can of beans Henry had placed in her bucket without listing on the receipt. She noticed the can only after she had returned. There had been no note, no instruction, no kindness that required her to stand there and receive it under another person's eyes. She opened it with a rusted church key from the drawer, warmed the beans in the can on the stovetop, and ate with a strip of cardboard folded into a spoon. The beans tasted of metal, smoke, and survival. Afterward she did not sleep. Heat had given her one room, and one room had given her enough courage to look at the back. She took the flashlight into the cutting room and began inventory the way Tio Nacho had taught her long ago, left to right, top to bottom, no touching until looking had done its work. On the first bench were 3 cracked dop pots, 2 empty cans of black wax, a jar of wooden dowels, and a coffee tin filled with nails, screws, broken saw teeth, and 1 silver button. A tray held agate scraps, most of them fractured or too thin to cut. Beneath the bench sat a foot pedal assembly disconnected from whatever machine it once served, a wooden crate full of rotted belts, and a stack of newspapers dated across several winters in the early 1990s. On the wall above hung tools in silhouettes of absence. The pegboard still showed outlines where pliers, saw frames, and hammers had once rested. What remained was modest: 1 half-round file, a pair of dividers with stiff legs, 2 tweezers, a bent soldering pick, and a brass brush worn almost bald. At the silver bench, she opened the little drawers carefully. One held green polishing compound wrapped in wax paper. One held borax in a jar cloudy with age. One held copper scraps curled like fingernail parings. In the bottom drawer she found a handwritten chart of silver solder temperatures taped to cardboard. Easy, 1,325 degrees medium, 1,390, hard, 1,450. The numbers had been written by someone who cared enough to leave them where a beginner might see. The polishing station held 2 wheels hardened by age, tripoli residue packed near the spindle, a cracked leather belt, and a pan of gray slurry dried into a pattern like desert mud. The trim saw, when she lifted its tarp, revealed a 10-inch blade dull with rust but not broken. Its coolant pan was dry, except for a crust of mineral sediment along one edge. The motor belt had snapped and lay curled beneath it. Then there was the slab saw. Ruby stood before it with the flashlight hanging from her wrist. The machine occupied the center of the room as if the building had been assembled around it. Its sliding carriage was locked in place by a steel pin. The vise jaws were open, wide enough to hold a stone larger than a bread loaf. The blade housing, bolted down, bore scratches along its edge where other hands had opened and closed it for years. The oil reservoir beneath was rectangular, deep, and lidded, with a drain plug low on one side and 2 handles on the top plate. The lid seam had been sealed by grime so complete it looked original to the casting. Ruby moved around it once. On the wall behind the saw hung a faded sign, hand-lettered on plywood, "Keep oil above blade line." Beside it was a grease pencil mark at shoulder height, perhaps where someone had measured slabs or children. On the floor near the machine, she noticed dark stains where oil had once overflowed, then collected dust until it became a kind of false stone. She did not open the reservoir that night. She only learned its edges, its bolts, its weight in the room. The next morning, after another walk for water and a stop at Medina Hardware to return the manual long enough for Henry to photocopy the missing chimney diagram, he said should have been in it, she came back with a putty knife, penetrating oil, and a used crescent wrench Henry added to her account for $4. "Do not use your good knife on old machine sludge," he said. "I do not have a good knife." Then, by noon, she had cleared the area around the slab saw. She swept the dust into careful piles, not because the floor would ever be clean in the ordinary sense, but because loose grit hid washers, glass, and small truths. Under the machine she found a penny from 1974, a brass screw, 2 mouse bones, and a sliver of turquoise so thin it had escaped every broom before hers. She placed the turquoise on the bench in a small dish. Then she began testing. The carriage moved after oil and persuasion, its rollers groaning along the rail. The vise turned one full rotation, then jammed. The blade, visible through the guard, had rust freckles but no missing teeth. The reservoir lid did not move. Ruby brushed the seam with the wire brush, sprayed penetrating oil around each bolt, and waited the way old tools required. Waiting was work too, though it did not look like it. While she waited, she tapped. Tio Nacho had taught her sound tests on stone, not machines. A cracked slab answered differently than a sound one. A hidden fracture returned a dullness to the knuckle. Ruby used the wooden handle of the wire brush, striking lightly along the reservoir side, then the lid, then the lower plate. Most of the machine answered with a dead, thick note of cast iron and dried oil. But near the right rear corner of the reservoir, below the lid and above the drain line, the sound changed. Not louder, hollower. It held a small space inside it, a careful absence. Ruby tapped again. The note returned. She crouched and shone the flashlight into the narrow gap between the reservoir and the frame. There, behind a lip of metal and decades of black dust, she saw the edge of something not iron. A circle, perhaps 4 inches across, set into the inside wall of the reservoir near the corner. It was the color of old cedar, darkened almost brown-black, and it had been disguised by sludge so well that only the light at an angle showed its grain. A disc. She sat back on her heels. There was no reason for a cedar disc inside the oil reservoir of a slab saw. At least, no ordinary reason. Ruby did not hurry. The room seemed to ask that of her. She cleaned around the reservoir plug first, placing the dented bucket beneath it, though she expected nothing. The plug resisted, then turned with a soft crack of old sealant. A line of black liquid emerged, slow and thick, not oil enough to pour, but enough to stain the bucket bottom with a smell that made her pull the mask over her face. She let it drain for nearly an hour. Sludge followed, then nothing. With the reservoir emptied, she loosened the lid bolts one by one. 2 came free. 1 stripped. 1 had to be coaxed with oil, waiting, and the steady pressure of the wrench. The stripped one she left for last, cutting a new groove across its head with the edge of a file and turning it with both hands while whispering no words at all. The lid lifted only after she worked the putty knife around the seam. It rose with a tearing sound as old gasket. Oil, dust, and time surrendered together. The inside of the reservoir was a trough of blackened metal, coated in dried sludge, grit, and mineral paste. Ruby cleaned only the corner where the disc sat. The cedar had been fitted into a circular recess and sealed around its edge with wax or resin, now hardened into a dark ring. At the center of the disc was a little brass screw, its slot green with corrosion. She touched the wood with one gloved finger. It held. Her hands had begun to tremble, so she stopped. She went to the front room, drank water, ate the saved half tortilla though she did not want it, and sat by the stove until her breathing slowed. A hurried hand broke what a careful hand might reveal. The sentence came not as memory alone, but as instruction. She returned to the cutting room with the flashlight, the small screwdriver from the silver bench, the putty knife, and a strip of cloth. The screw turned after 3 tries. The disc did not fall. It had swollen or been fitted tight. Ruby worked the putty knife along the edge, no more than a fraction of an inch at a time. Resin cracked. Cedar gave off a faint smell when the blade disturbed it, dry and clean under all that oil. The disc shifted once, then stopped. She worked around again. Her shoulders burned. A splinter lifted, and she froze, unwilling to damage what someone had hidden with such deliberate care. At last the disc came free into her palm. Behind it was darkness. Not a large opening. Not a treasure chest. A cylindrical cavity had been bored or cast into the thick side compartment behind the reservoir wall, just deep enough for a hand and forearm. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the end of a package tied with cotton cord. Ruby did not reach blindly. She shone the light first. There were 3 packages in the cavity, stacked with exactness. The first was long and narrow. The second was square, heavy-looking, and wrapped twice. The third was a flat tin box, wedged at the back and protected by a folded strip of waxed canvas. Around them were small raw stones packed in cloth, their shapes irregular, their surfaces pale under dust. She removed the long package first. The cord had stiffened. She untied it rather than cut it, because cutting felt too final. Inside the oilcloth lay a leather roll, black with age but supple where the oil had protected it. Ruby opened it on the bench. Gravers. Not many. 6. A flat graver, 2 onglet, 1 scorper, 1 knife graver, and a tiny lining tool. Their handles were worn smooth by fingers. Each steel point had been cleaned before storage and wrapped in oiled paper. Beside them, tucked into a pocket, was a burnisher, a scribe, and a pair of dividers finer than the bent pair on the wall. The tools did not shine. They did not need to. They carried the look of things kept for use, not display. Ruby touched the handle of the flat graver with the back of 1 finger. The second package was heavier than she expected. When she lifted it, something inside shifted with a dense, dry weight. The oilcloth was tied in 2 directions and sealed at the knot with red wax. She broke the wax carefully and opened the wrapping layer by layer. Inside were bundles of cash, each wrapped in paper bands browned with age, and beneath them, cloth packets filled with stone. For a while, Ruby did not understand what she was seeing. The mind, when shown too much possibility at once, sometimes protects itself by becoming practical. She set the bundles in rows. 20s, 50s, hundreds. Some older, some newer, none recent. The paper bands had amounts written in pencil, but she did not trust them until she counted. Her hands worked slowly. 10 20s made 200. 5 bundles made 1,000. The hundreds were crisp in the middle and soft at the edges. Several 50s bore older designs she had only seen in cash drawers when customers paid with bills saved too long in envelopes. She counted once on the bench, then again on the floor, because the bench had a slight tilt. The total came to $40,073. The cents were in a small muslin bag beneath the cash, 4 Walking Liberty half-dollars, 3 Mercury dimes, 6 wheat pennies, and 1 worn buffalo nickel whose date had nearly vanished. The oddness of the amount made it more believable, not less. Someone had saved not a round idea of money, but everything that belonged to the hiding. Ruby sat back against the leg of the bench and closed her eyes. She did not cry. Her body did something quieter. It refused to move for several minutes. Her hands rested open on her knees. Black at the nails, palms lined with dust. The room held its silence around the money, the tools, the opened machine. Then she remembered the stones. The cloth packets were tied with different threads. 1 red, 1 blue, 1 plain cotton. Inside them lay rough turquoise in pieces larger and finer than anything she had ever held. Some were robin's egg blue, clean as winter sky. Some carried brown matrix like dry riverbeds seen from above. 1 green-blue stone had golden host rock running through it in a pattern like lightning held still. None had been stabilized. None had been dyed. Even through dust and old cloth, the stones carried their own authority. A folded paper lay beneath the packets. Ruby did not open it. Not yet. The tin box came last. It was rectangular, dark blue once, now rubbed to bare metal at the corners. The lid had been taped shut with cloth tape that had dried but not failed. Ruby slit the tape along one edge and opened the box. Inside lay a military medal wrapped in a handkerchief, a small envelope, and a black and white photograph of a man in uniform standing beside a woman on the porch of the workshop. The photograph had silvered at the edges, but the sign above them was readable enough to make Ruby's breath catch. The woman's face was not familiar exactly, yet something in the set of her mouth and the steadiness of her gaze seemed to come forward through time with a claim of kinship. The medal was a purple heart. On the back, engraved in small letters, was a name she did not know in the year 1951. Ruby placed it on the cloth beside the photograph and folded her hands in her lap. The third item in the tin was the small envelope. It had no stamp, no address, only writing across the front in ink-faded brown. For the one who opens the saw. The handwriting was careful, slanted slightly left, and old enough in style to belong to someone who had been taught penmanship as discipline, not decoration. Ruby looked at the envelope for a long time. The room had changed. Not outwardly. The roof still leaked. The stove still needed repair. The back wall still bowed. The reservoir stood open, smelling of oil and metal. Dust lay over everything not yet touched by her hands. Yet the place no longer felt abandoned. Abandonment suggested that someone had left without intention. This was different. Someone had hidden, protected, measured, sealed, and waited. She did not open the envelope. Even hunger had not taught her to consume everything at once. Some things required mourning. Some words deserved a clean table, washed hands, and a mind not stunned by the weight of cash and stone. Ruby gathered the money into the oilcloth again, not counting it a third time. She wrapped the turquoise in its cloth packets, replaced the coin bag beside the bundles, and set the medal and photograph back into the tin without closing the lid. The leather roll of gravers she wrapped separately in the strip of cloth she had brought. Then she looked at the open cavity in the slab saw. She could not put everything back into the machine, not after opening it. but she could keep the room from learning her discovery too loudly. She placed the cedar disc loosely over the hole, set the reservoir lid back in position without bolting it, and draped the torn tarp from the trim saw across the machine. To a glance, it looked as it had before, heavy, useless, dark with age. She carried the packages to the front room and hid them beneath the lowest shelf behind a row of empty grit tins until she could think more clearly. The envelope she kept apart. She slid it into the field pouch with the deed, then removed it again, too close to her own restless body, too easy to bend. At last she placed it inside the blue tin box and set the tin on the counter beneath the crooked calendar. By then the sun had lowered. Ruby stepped outside without her coat buttoned and did not notice the cold at first. The yard behind the workshop sloped toward a narrow irrigation ditch that carried winter water slowly under a skin of ice. Beyond it, land opened in rough grass, rabbit brush, and low mounds of snow. The walnut trees stood between the building and the road, their branches drawing dark lines across a pale sky. Farther west, the light had begun to turn the mountains purple at their bases, while the higher ridges held a last band of copper. She walked to the ditch and stood there until the cold entered her sleeves. Water moved beneath the ice with a sound so slight she had to be still to hear it. Not rushing, not singing, only going on. It passed under frozen edges, around stones, beneath dead grass, carrying silt, carrying light, carrying nothing that needed a witness and yet receiving one. Ruby crouched and placed one blackened hand on her knee. $40,073 sat inside the ruined room behind her, along with turquoise finer than any stone she had touched since childhood. The amount was enough to change certain facts quickly. A motel room, food, boots, a phone, a lawyer, perhaps, a new bus ticket to somewhere warmer. But the thought of speed made the discovery feel endangered. A hurried hand broke what a careful hand might reveal. She watched the water instead. A truck passed on the road, slowing near the walnut trees, then continuing. Smoke rose from a chimney half a mile away. A dog barked twice and stopped. The first star appeared above the darkening roofline of the workshop. Ruby remained beside the ditch until her fingers hurt and the sky had nearly closed. When she went back inside, she did not touch the letter. She warmed beans over the stove, fed the fire one narrow split of wood at a time, and sat on the floor with her back against the counter, facing the door. The tin box rested within reach. The deed lay dry in the pouch. The money stayed hidden behind empty grit tins. The turquoise waited in cloth. The slab saw, under its torn tarp, held the shape of its secret even after surrendering it. That night, sleep came slowly again, but not from fear of being moved along. It came slowly because the room had become full of voices she had not yet earned the right to hear. Ruby lay beneath her coat and listened to the stove, the roof, the water in the ditch, and the long silence of work interrupted but not finished. The workshop was patient. So was she. At first light, Ruby cleared the counter as if preparing a table for someone expected. She did not have much to clear. A curled strip of velvet, 2 grit tins, a rusted awl, a coil of copper wire green at one end, and the old sales slip she had not burned. She moved each thing with care and wiped the wood with a damp cloth until the grain appeared through the dust in long brown streaks. The counter would never be clean in the way a kitchen table was clean. Not yet, but it could be made honest enough for paper. She washed her hands outside with water from the jug, rubbing ash from her fingers until the skin went raw and pink. The morning air took the heat from them immediately. She dried them on the inside of her coat because the outside smelled of smoke and machine oil. Then she went back into the front room, fed 2 shavings into the stove, and sat on the stool she had set upright the night before. The tin box waited beneath the crooked calendar. Ruby lifted the envelope from it and held it near the window. The handwriting had seemed merely old the night before. In the morning it became familiar in a way that unsettled her hands. The letters leaned left, each loop disciplined, each capital plain, the ink dark where the pen had paused and paler where the writer's hand had moved quickly. It was not her father's writing. It was not Tio Nacho's. Yet it carried the same devotion to exactness she had seen in their measurements, their labels, their tool marks, the same refusal to let haste enter where care belonged. She turned the envelope over. The flap had been sealed once with wax, then softened by time. Whoever had written it had expected the paper to travel through years, not miles. For the one who opens the saw. Ruby used the tip of the small soldering pick to lift the flap without tearing it. Inside was a folded letter, 6 pages written on cream paper that had darkened at the edges. A faint scent rose from it, cedar, oilcloth, old ink, and the mineral cold of the machine where it had waited. She unfolded the pages along their original creases and began. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened the saw, then the roof has likely failed, the sign has weathered badly, and the people who once knew this place by name are mostly gone from the roads that pass it. I am writing to you because Dr. Elias Warren at Presbyterian Hospital in Albuquerque has told me plainly that the sickness in my blood will not be bargained with. He said this on the 17th of October, 1991, in a small room that smelled of bleach and orange peel, while rain made streaks on the window glass. He was kind enough not to decorate the truth. I respected him for that. My name is Magdalena Salazar Vega, born in Truches in 1915, daughter of Tomas Salazar and Clara Montoya Salazar. My grandfather was Esteban Salazar, who came down from the high villages with a mule, 2 blankets, and a tin box of chisels in 1878. His wife, Lucia Ortega, was from Chimayo and knew how to trade wool without lowering her eyes. Esteban's father, Rafael, had cut shell, jet, and soft stone for saddle ornaments before silver work fed the family more steadily. Before him, there are only stories, and stories become smoke unless someone keeps a coal alive. The Vega name entered our line when my mother's sister married into a family of Smiths near Nambe. I married Daniel Vega in 1936 in the church at Ranchos de Taos, with snow on the churchyard wall and flour on my cuffs because I had been baking that morning. Daniel could raise a clean bezel faster than any man I ever knew, but he never rushed a stone. My brother Joaquin cut slabs. My son Mateo learned to polish before he learned to keep his shoes clean. If his name has reached you, remember him kindly. If it has not, know that he once carried a sleeping child on one shoulder while holding a box of turquoise in the other hand, and he never dropped either. This shop began as one room in 1948. We added the cutting room in '54 after Daniel bought the Highland Park saw from a man in Los Angeles who had lost patience with stone. The machine arrived on a flatbed, heavier than gossip and almost as difficult to move. Joaquin said we should name it St. Cecilia because it sang only when properly attended. We never did name it, but we respected it. The trade did not end in one day, though there was one day when I knew it had closed. March 3rd, 1966. That was the day the mine contract failed. The cooperative dissolved, and the man from Santa Fe took back 3 trays of unpaid work without looking me in the face. By then Daniel had been dead 12 years. Joaquin was buried under the flag they sent home after Korea. My boy had gone where work called him. I locked the front door that evening with 2 finished rings still in the display case and sat on the floor until the stove went cold. People will tell you a business closes because of money. Sometimes that is true. More often, it closes because grief takes the hands out of a craft, one finger at a time. For more than 30 years, I kept the building in my name and said very little. I paid what taxes I could. I cut stones only for old customers who found me by memory. I hid the cash because banks fail in their own way, and families fail in theirs, and I wanted one small inheritance to escape both noise and appetite. I hid the turquoise because raw stone should not be sold in panic. I hid the tools because tools remember the shape of hands better than people do. You will find Royston, Cerrillos, and a little old blue gem among the rough. Do not soak the turquoise until you know whether it has been stabilized. Most of mine has not. Cut slowly, with water enough to keep the heat down but not so much that you cannot hear the blade. If you make dop wax, use shellac and beeswax at roughly 4 parts to 1, and warm it until it softens, not until it smokes. For silver, remember that hard solder flows near 1450 degrees, medium near 1390, and easy lower still. Pickle should be warm, not boiling. If you quench too soon, you teach metal to complain. If you polish before the scratches are gone, you only make the mistakes brighter. For turquoise cabochons, begin with the line of the stone, not the shape you prefer. Some pieces ask for an oval, some for a long teardrop. Some are best left alone until your eyes grow more patient. Sand from 220 through 400, 600, 1200, and finer if the stone will bear it. Let each grit finish its own work. No grit forgives what the one before it refused to remove. Charge fairly. Repair honestly. Write measurements down. Feed yourself before you are faint. Sweep before you cannot see the floor. I do not know your face. Perhaps you are blood. Perhaps you are not. The law cares about names, but inheritance is older than law and more exact. It belongs to the person willing to keep faith with what the dead could not finish. Do not spend the money to prove anything to anyone. Do not show the turquoise to hungry eyes. Do not let loneliness make you careless. If you reopen this place, open it quietly. If you leave it better closed than you found it. Behind the shop, near the west walnut, Daniel set a horseshoe into the trunk the year our son was born. It will be nearly swallowed by bark now, if the tree still lives. Touch it for me. Not for luck. For witness. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Magdalena Salazar Vega. November 2, 1991. Ruby did not move when the last line ended. The stove breathed behind her. A coal shifted and made a small inward sound. Outside, the walnut branches tapped once against one another in the wind. The letter lay open under both her hands, and she kept her palms flat beside it so she would not grip the paper too hard. She read it again. The second reading was slower. Names entered differently after the first shock of them had passed. Tomas. Clara. Esteban.
Lucia.
Rafael. Daniel. Joaquin. Mateo. Not all of them belonged to her by legal proof she could carry into an office, but they had been carried by the same craft, the same materials, the same careful refusal to hurry what could break. That was a kind of kinship Ruby understood before she understood whether she had the right to claim it. When she reached the sentence about Mateo carrying a sleeping child, her eyes moved to the photograph tucked near the deed. She took it from the field pouch and held it beside the letter. Her father and Tio Nacho stood outside a shed she had known. But now the sign on this workshop stood behind another generation in another photograph, and the distance between the two images seemed less like distance than a long hallway with doors left ajar. Ruby folded the letter along its original creases. She did not smooth them away. The creases had preserved the order of the pages for longer than she had been alive, and she would not correct them now. She placed the letter back into the envelope, then removed it again, unable to put it out of sight so soon. At last she laid it inside the tin box beside the photograph in the metal, leaving the lid open. Her hands smelled faintly of old paper. She stood. The back door was swollen worse than the front and had been nailed once near the bottom, perhaps to keep animals out. Ruby worked the nail loose with the claw end of a small hammer from the silver bench. Wood complained. Dust fell from the upper frame. When the door opened, cold light entered the back room and spread across the concrete floor. Touching the slab saw, the benches and the dark streaks where oil had lived. Ruby stepped outside. The yard behind the shop looked ordinary at first, and ordinariness made the letter's instruction feel more intimate. A person could hide meaning inside what everyone else passed without seeing. There were rabbit tracks near the ditch, a broken length of pipe half buried in snow, the collapsed pile of lumber she had noticed before, and beyond it the two walnut trees, one nearer the road and one farther west, its trunk wider, bark deeply furrowed and dark where old snow had melted into the grooves. She walked toward the west tree. The ground was uneven under the snow. Dry grass caught at her hem. She circled the walnut once, studying its trunk the way she had studied the reservoir wall. Bark had grown in ridges thick as knuckles. On the south side she saw nothing. On the east, only a healed limb scar. On the north side, where the light struck at an angle, there was an arc of rust nearly the same color as the bark. Ruby brushed it with her gloved fingers. A horseshoe. Most of it had been swallowed. Only the outer curve and two nail holes remained visible, embedded deep in the living trunk. The tree had grown around it year by year, not rejecting the iron and not yielding to it, simply carrying it forward in the only manner a tree knew. Ruby touched the exposed metal. It was cold enough to sting. Not for luck. For witness. She stood with her hand on the horseshoe for a long time. The letter had asked nothing extravagant of her. Not revenge. Not proof. Not a performance of gratitude before strangers. It had asked her to touch iron in a tree and remember that someone had stood here before her with a child newly born, a shop still young, and a faith that hands could carry a family through more than one season of loss. Ruby leaned her forehead against the bark. She did not speak. Speech would have reduced the thing. When she returned inside, she brought with her a twig from the walnut that had fallen near the roots. She set it on the counter beside the tin box. Its buds were closed tight, black and patient. The next task was light. The letter had been written on November 2nd, a date Ruby knew from childhood graveside visits and votive candles. From marigolds, sugar, silence, and names spoken toward the unseen. In the drawer behind the counter, beneath a folded cloth stiff with age, she found 3 candles wrapped in yellowed paper. They were beeswax, narrow, slightly bent, and marked by a label from a Taos church supply store that no longer existed. The paper crackled when she opened it. The candles smelled faintly of honey and dust. One had a penciled note on the wrapper. For storms. Magdalena had written, or for the dead. Ruby set the candle in a small silver holder from the display case, one with tarnish gathered thick in its pattern. She did not polish it. Not yet. Tarnish was only time made visible, and that morning time had earned its place in the room. She placed the holder on the counter. Beside the open tin, the walnut twig, and the envelope. The match shook slightly in her fingers. She struck it once. It failed. She struck another. Flame rose sulfur blue. Then yellow. Ruby touched it to the wick and watched the beeswax darken, soften, and take. The candle gave a modest light, almost shy under the daylight from the windows, but it changed the counter. It made the letter seem less discovered than received. For several minutes she did nothing but watch the flame. Then memory began arranging itself around the small light, not in grand scenes, but in pieces that could fit inside an ordinary human hand. Mrs. Quintana smoothing the worn bill before placing it in the drawer. The bus driver carrying her 2 blocks farther because the wind was mean. The librarian setting the assistance flyer face down. Henry placing a can of beans in the bucket without writing it on the receipt. The nurse in the hospital chapel leaving broth beside a sleeping stranger. The woman near the hardware store asking if she needed a ride, though Ruby had refused too quickly. None of them had saved her in the way stories sometimes pretend a person can be saved all at once. They had only placed a board across one narrow part of the river. A cup. A warning. A map. A can of beans. A folded flyer. A ride offered. Small things. Nearly deniable. Each one easy to overlook if a person believed only large gestures counted. Ruby looked at the candle and understood that she had arrived by a chain of quiet hands. And if you are listening to this now, maybe you have one of those small kindnesses stored somewhere in you. Not the kind that made a newspaper. Not the kind anyone else would remember. Maybe it was a sandwich wrapped in foil. A stranger holding a door when you had no strength left. A teacher who pretended not to notice you needed extra time. A neighbor who shoveled your steps before sunrise. A nurse who touched your shoulder with clean hands. If you have such a kindness, write it down in the comments when you are ready. Someone else may be reading from a cold room. Someone else may need to know that small mercy can travel farther than the person who first gave it. Ruby stayed by the counter until the candle burned down a full inch. Then she made herself work. Not because the letter had failed to move her, but because being moved was not the same as being faithful. She returned the money to a safer place beneath the floorboard behind the counter, one she had discovered that morning when sweeping. The board lifted with a careful pry, revealing a shallow space between joists dry enough for temporary keeping. She wrapped the cash twice, set the coin bag beside it, and replaced the board. Over it she placed the empty display case tray and 2 tins of grit. The turquoise she hid elsewhere, inside a wall cabinet whose false back had warped away from its frame. The gravers she kept near the silver bench, because tools hidden too deeply could become objects instead of companions. The metal remained in the tin box. She did not yet know what to do with a soldier's grief. She only knew it did not belong under grit tins or behind boards. She wrapped it again in the handkerchief and placed it beside the photograph, then closed the lid for the first time since opening it. The sound was soft, a little click of metal accepting metal. By afternoon, clouds came over the mountains. The room dimmed, and Ruby lit the stove earlier than usual. She made a meal of beans, tortillas, and a little rice from a paper bag Henry had added to her account after pretending it had been torn and therefore unsellable. While the rice cooked in too much water inside a dented pan, she sat on the floor and read the letter a third time, this time aloud. Her voice changed as she read. It slowed where the handwriting tightened. It lowered on the names. It steadied on the instructions about solder, grit, wax, and turquoise. When she came to the closing line, she did not read it louder. She barely read it above the sound of the stove. Yet the room seemed to take it in more completely than any shouted promise could have done. You are welcome here. The words did not erase the past 6 weeks. They did not return the blue ceramic bowl, the lost stones, her father's tools, or the years her mother had spent looking down at sinks instead of telling the truth. They did not make the roof whole or the chimney sound. They did not fill a pantry. They did not remove the county's demolition schedule from its file. They only did one thing. They gave Ruby permission to stop standing outside her own life. That evening she prepared her sleeping place with more ceremony than comfort required. She swept the floorboards between the counter and the stove. She folded one shirt into a pillow and laid her coat over her blanketless body the way she had done before. But tonight she placed the tin box near her left shoulder, the letter inside it, the metal wrapped, the photograph face down to protect it from ash. Beside the box she laid the leather roll of gravers, tied shut. Beside that, the walnut twig with its closed buds. She banked the fire carefully, learning the stove's appetite. Too much wood and it burned hot, wasting itself before midnight. Too little and the room froze by 2. She set one split at an angle over the coals and closed the loose door with a piece of wire looped around the handle. The chimney drew cleanly. Outside, the wind came and went along the roof seams, but the smoke rose as it should. Ruby lay down. The floor was still hard. Her feet still hurt. Her stomach was not full enough. The building remained condemned by every authority that measured safety in forms and inspections. But under the counter, money lay hidden not as escape, but as time. In the wall cabinet, turquoise waited not as treasure, but as work. In the tin box, the letter rested with the medal and the photograph, not as proof of belonging to anyone else, but as an invitation to keep a chain from breaking. Sleep came nearer than it had since winter began. Before it reached her, Ruby opened her eyes once more and looked toward the back room. Through the doorway she could see the shape of the slab saw under its torn tarp, broad and still in the dark. It had kept faith with a dead woman longer than some living people kept faith with their own blood. It had waited without complaint, full of oil, dust, money, stone, tools, and words, while roofs failed and maps forgot the road. Ruby turned onto her side, one hand resting lightly on the tin box. In the stove, a coal split open and showed its red center. She slept with the heirlooms beside her. The first snow that mattered came on December 12, 4 inches by dawn, with another inch feathering down after breakfast. Ruby knew the depth because she took a ruler from the silver bench drawer and measured in 3 places, by the front step, beneath the east window where the wind had drifted it, and near the walnut tree where the branches had kept the ground partly bare. She wrote the numbers on the back of a sales slip and taped it beside the stove, not because the snow itself required record, but because weather had become part of the work. If she was going to keep the building, she would have to learn the sky as carefully as any machine. The roof could not wait. That had been true from the first night, but snow made truth visible. Meltwater found the seams by noon, and drops began falling into the front room with an almost polite rhythm. One into the dented bucket, one near the counter, one onto the strip of velvet in the empty display case. In the back room, a darker stain spread over the rafters above the polishing wheels, and Ruby stood beneath it with her head tilted back, watching water gather, swell, and fall through dust. She walked to Medina Hardware with her notes folded in her pocket. Henry was restocking stove gaskets when she came in, a strip of black rope seal looped over one shoulder like a tired snake. He listened while she described the seams, the lifted metal, the sag over the cutting room, the soft place near the stovepipe, and the rusted fasteners that had lost their bite. "You read roofing?" he asked. "I read the chapter 3 times. Read it once more after. Yes, sir. He pulled a ledger from beneath the counter and drew the roof roughly from her measurements. The front room, 26 by 16. The cutting room, 32 by 20. Shallow pitch. Corrugated metal over wood strips in front. Patched roll roofing over the rear addition, which explained the worst leaking. He shook his head once at the roll roofing. Not in surprise, but in old disappointment. You are not replacing the whole roof this month, he said. I know. You are making it stay alive. Ruby nodded. Henry wrote the material list with a carpenter's pencil. 2 squares of 3-tab asphalt shingles for the rear low section where the roll roofing had failed beyond patching. 1 roll of 15-pound felt. 2 bundles of furring strips. 10 pounds of 1 1/4-inch galvanized roofing nails. 3 tubes of asphalt roof cement. 1 box of neoprene washer screws for the corrugated metal. 6 pieces of step flashing to cut and shape near the chimney. 1 chalk line, used. 1 utility knife. 1 flat pry bar, already owned by nobody and therefore by the store. Then he added a line she had not expected. Roofing hatchet, loan. From beneath a back shelf, he brought out a hatchet with a square pole, a worn wooden handle, and a sliding gauge blackened by use. The head had been sharpened, but not polished. On the handle, burned faintly near the end, were the initials RM. My brothers, Henry said. Rahman was better on a roof than on the ground. He died owing me $30.50 apology. You bring this back when your roof quits crying. Ruby closed her fingers around the handle. It fit as if many hands had taught it where to rest. I will take care of it. You will use it. Care is not the same thing as worship. The materials arrived the next morning in the back of a faded blue pickup driven by Henry's nephew, who refused to let Ruby help unload the heaviest bundles, but accepted coffee made from grounds boiled twice. He stacked the shingles under the porch roof, set the felt upright against the wall, and left before thanks could lengthen into discomfort. With the truck came someone else. He was introduced only after he had already looked at the roof, the wall, the chimney, the porch posts, and Ruby's shoes. His name was Abel Romero. He was 81, narrow as a fence rail, with hands like dry roots and a face browned by decades of sun reflected off roofs, roads, and winter snow. He wore a canvas coat patched at both elbows, a knitted cap pulled low, and boots that had been resoled more than once. His left eye watered constantly in the cold, and he wiped it with the back of his glove, as if annoyed by the interruption. Henry said you need a roof kept on, Abel said. Yes, sir. I do not do ladders for people who talk too much. Ruby looked at him, unsure whether that required an answer. He nodded once, satisfied. The ladder came from his shed, tied to the roof of his truck with rope older than Ruby. It was wooden, heavy, and scarred. Abel placed it himself, tested it twice, then made Ruby climb 3 rungs and come down. Again, she climbed, came down. Again. By the 4th time, she understood he was not testing courage. He was teaching the body to return safely before the work began. They worked 11 days, not all in a row. Weather took 2 mornings, wind took 1 afternoon, and Abel's knees took whatever time they required without apology. He would arrive after sunrise, drink 1 cup of coffee from his own thermos, and point to the first task. Carry felt. Hold line. Watch your foot. Not there. His teaching style was terse enough to be mistaken for impatience, but Ruby learned to hear the care inside it. He never let her step backward without looking. He never passed a blade handle first unless he had the other end covered. When she drove a nail too high, he said, "That nail's proud." She pulled it. When she tried to save a bent shingle, he said, "Trash lies later." She threw it down. The worst section lay over the back room, where water had softened two rafters near the chimney side. Abel showed her how to sister a rafter, cutting new lumber to fit alongside the weak member, clamping it tight, and fastening it with staggered screws so the load would spread rather than split. He made her mark the cut twice and sit still before sawing. "Measure tired," he said. "Cut wrong." They snapped chalk lines across the rear section, the blue string humming before it struck felt and left its straight powder trace. Abel taught her to keep the first course honest because every crookedness after that would be its child. He showed her how to set the hatchet gauge, hook a shingle, cut clean, and drive a roofing nail in 3 strokes. Set, seat, finish. Not 4. Not 5. 3 if the wrist was true. By the 7th day, Ruby's hands had opened in 2 places, one blister torn below the thumb and one split along the index finger. She wrapped them in cloth and kept working. Abel saw the cloth but said nothing until she began favoring the hand. "Pain talks," he said. "I hear it." Then answer. He made her climb down, wash the cut, and put on the crooked leather gloves from Henry's store. The work slowed. It did not stop. The corrugated front roof did not need replacing, only fastening, sealing, and respect. Ruby tightened washer screws where the metal had lifted, worked roof cement under one seam with a putty knife, and set stones aside because Abel said roofs held by rocks were roofs waiting to leave. Near the chimney, they cut flashing to step against the brick, each piece tucked above the next so water would be led away without being noticed. That, Abel said, was the nature of good work. It did not announce itself. It simply kept trouble moving past. On December 19, they finished at mid-afternoon. Ruby stood in the yard while Abel climbed down the ladder for the last time. Snow remained in shaded places, but the sun had opened the sky wide and pale. The roof did not look new. That pleased her more than she expected. It looked mended, tightened, brought back into its own shape without being made to pretend it had never suffered weather. Abel rolled his rope, wiped his eye, and looked up once. "It will hold winter." Ruby reached into her pocket for the money she had prepared. Not much, but folded cleanly. He did not take it. "Henry said your people knew stone." "My father did." "Then fix something later. For somebody." He lifted the ladder onto his truck with a movement too quick for his age, tied it down, and drove away before she could give him the kind of thanks that would embarrass them both. That night, when the wind rose and snow hissed lightly against the metal, Ruby lay on the floor and waited for the first drip. None came. By January, the chimney had become the next honest problem. The roof no longer leaked in the front room, and the back room stayed mostly dry, though wind still found the lower wall and moved dust in long pale threads across the concrete. But the chimney crown remained broken, and the bricks above the roof line had begun to spall. Freeze and thaw had entered them year after year, splitting their faces until red flakes lay on the metal roof like fallen scales. When Ruby rubbed one brick with her thumb, powdered mortar sifted down and vanished into the snow. She brought a piece of it to Henry. He rolled it between his fingers and frowned. Too much Portland in an old chimney repair. Hard mortar on soft brick. It traps water, then winter does the rest. What does it need? Lime. Patience. Less pride. He turned toward the back room of the store and returned with a half bag of hydraulic lime, a smaller sack of fire clay, and a coffee can of washed sand. He wrote ratios on brown paper, 2 parts sand, 1 part hydraulic lime for the outer joints, with a small measure of fire clay where heat mattered near the upper flue liner. For the firebox cracks inside the stove collar, he had her use stove cement, not mortar. The chimney needed to breathe where it was old and hold where it carried heat. "Do not make it stronger than the brick," he said. Ruby wrote that down. The work took 3 weeks because winter was not interested in her schedule. Most mornings sat in the 20s, and the mortar had to be protected from freezing before it cured. Abel returned once. Not to work. He said, only to see whether she had arranged the ladder in a way that would shorten her life. He adjusted its angle, kicked the feet into frozen ground, and handed her a rope. "Tie your bucket." "Yes, sir." "Do not carry food." He left after 10 minutes and took none of the coffee she had warmed. Ruby worked in layers of preparation because masonry punished haste differently than carpentry. First, she raked out the loose joints with a narrow chisel and a wire brush, removing old mortar until she reached material that held. She did not dig too deep. Henry had warned her that old brick could be loosened by enthusiasm. Then she misted the joints lightly with water so the dry brick would not steal moisture from the new mortar too quickly. Her hands went numb every 15 minutes. She learned the signs before pain arrived fully. First, the fingertips stopped distinguishing between brick and glove. Then the knuckles stiffened. Then the wrist became clumsy. She would climb down, tuck her hands under her arms near the stovepipe, breathe on them, flex each finger, and climb again. The day's work became a series of small ascents and returns, like prayer made inconvenient by weather. The mortar mixed stiff enough to hold on the trowel but soft enough to press deep into joints. In the dented bucket, lime, sand, fire clay, and water turned from dust into body. Ruby mixed with a margin trowel Henry had sold her for 60 cents because the handle was cracked. She pressed mortar into the joints in small amounts, packed it with a tuck pointer, and struck the line smooth only after the surface had firmed. On the first day, she struck too early, smearing the face of the brick. She cleaned it with a damp sponge and began again. No one saw most of the work. That suited it. From the road, the chimney was only a blunt shape against the winter sky. Up close, it was a patient argument with weather. Ruby replaced 2 bricks at the crown with salvaged ones from the lumber pile, choosing those closest in density and color. She reset the capstone with a slight slope so water would move away. She patched a crack near the flue tile, sealed the stove collar below, and cleared more creosote dislodged by the earlier brushing. At night, she covered the repaired crown with burlap and a scrap of tarp. Weighting it with bricks Abel said were too poor to use but good enough to hold cloth. Each morning she climbed up and checked whether the mortar had survived. Most of it did. One joint failed after a hard freeze. She raked it out without complaint, because disappointment had no special authority over mortar. A failed joint was only a joint not yet done right. Late in the month, on a day when the temperature rose to 34 and the snow softened at the edges, Henry walked out after closing to inspect the work. He stood in the yard, hands in his coat pockets, chin lifted. "Light it," he said. Ruby had already laid the stove. She used dry kindling, 1 narrow split, and a page from an old catalog that had been too mouse-eaten to save. The flame caught. Smoke rose into the pipe, paused only briefly, then pulled upward with a clean and steady draw. Outside, the chimney breathed a thin gray column that straightened in the cold air and dispersed without rolling back. Henry watched for 10 minutes. No smoke in the... No, sir. Any... Only stove. He nodded. Then the chimney remembers its work. Ruby stood beside him while the smoke thinned. The evening light had turned the snow blue. On the roof, the new flashing held its line. Above it, the patched chimney did not look young, but it looked willing. Inside, heat gathered without bitterness. That night she cooked rice and beans with a little onion Doris from the cafe had given her in a paper, refusing money because the onion had sprouted and was therefore, according to Doris, no longer fit for respectable customers. Ruby ate sitting on the floor, back against the counter, watching the stove draw cleanly. When the wind came down after dark, the smoke did not enter. The roof did not leak. The chimney did not complain. For the first time, warmth stayed without asking to be forgiven. The floors asked for attention after the chimney began behaving. In the front room, the white pine planks had been worn by years of boots. Grit, chair legs, dropped tools, and weather entering through seams. Some boards had darkened nearly black near the door. Others, protected under the old display case, remained pale beneath the dirt, showing narrow growth lines and saw marks that had not been erased by time. The nails were hand-cut rosehead nails in the oldest part, their heads irregular and beautiful, though some had risen just enough to catch a sock or a careless foot. Ruby did not want to make the floor new. She wanted to make it safe, clean, and able to receive light again. Henry rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day and made her repeat the operating instructions before he would let it leave the store. Do not stay in one hollow. Vacuum between grits if you can. Sweep twice if you cannot. He gave her sandpaper discs in 3 grits, 80, 120, and 220. The 80 would take off the old grime and raised splinters. The 120 would remove the scratch pattern left behind. The 220 would prepare the wood to accept oil without holding roughness under her hand. Before sanding, Ruby set every proud nail. She used a nail set Abel had lent her, tapping each rosehead gently until it sat just below the surface without losing its old shape. There were 53 nails in the front room that required attention. She counted because counting kept frustration from becoming a fog. 3 boards near the left window had to be lifted and reset after damp had loosened them. 1 split plank was repaired from below with a cleat and screws placed where they would not show. The floor was not perfect when she finished preparation. It was honest enough to sand. The machine was heavier than it looked. It pulled against her arms when she started it, humming with a force that made the loose window glass rattle. Dust rose immediately, and even with the mask tied tight, she tasted pine, old dirt, and a faint sweetness released from wood that had been sealed under neglect. She worked in long passes with the grain, never lingering where the boards dipped, letting the sander's weight do what pressure would have ruined. The first pass with 80 grit revealed a floor the color of dry straw beneath the gray. She swept twice, as Henry had instructed, pushing dust into a pile that looked almost like flour mixed with ash. The second pass, with 120, softened the harsh marks and brought out darker streaks where knots had held resin. The third pass, with 220, made the boards feel different under her palm. Not smooth like furniture, smooth like a tool handle worn by use. The back room's concrete could wait. The front room was where she slept, ate, read, counted money she did not spend, and warmed her hands. The front room was becoming the chamber where survival changed into keeping. For finish, Henry offered polyurethane. Ruby looked at the can and then at the floor. Is there another way? He studied her for a moment. Tung oil, if you can afford slow. Linseed if you need cheaper. Blend will do, but it needs cure time, air, and patience. 3 coats minimum. Thin first coat. Wipe what does not soak. 48 hours between if the room is cold. She chose the oil. The first coat darkened the pine immediately, turning dry straw to warm honey. The thirsty boards drank unevenly, darker near knots, lighter where old wear had closed the grain. Ruby worked on her knees with a rag folded flat, rubbing oil into each plank, wiping excess before it grew sticky. The smell filled the room, nutty and deep, mingling with stove smoke and winter air. She left the windows cracked despite the cold because Henry had warned her not to trap fumes. 48 hours later, the second coat pulled the color deeper, honey shifting toward amber, then toward a brown-red glow near the stove. By the third coat, the floor had taken on a dark mahogany warmth in the worn paths, while the protected boards near the counter remained lighter, as if holding several histories at once. Ruby sat back on her heels and watched the firelight move across it. The boards did not shine loudly. They held light in a low, inward way. Then came the bad morning. It arrived without weather to blame. The roof held. The chimney drew. The floor had cured well enough to walk on in socks. There was food in the drawer. Not much, but enough. The money remained hidden. The turquoise waited. The letter rested in its tin. Yet Ruby woke with her body refusing the next task. Her arms felt heavy before lifting anything. Her hands ached in the old split places. The thought of scraping, carrying, measuring, or speaking to anyone made the air seem thick. She put on her coat and left the workshop without breakfast. There was no marsh in the grand sense, only a low wet place beyond the irrigation ditch where snowmelt collected among cattails, willow stems, and grass flattened by winter. Still, water stood there under thin ice, reflecting the sky in broken pieces. Ruby walked until her shoes reached the edge and then sat on a stone, knees drawn up, hands in her sleeves. A great blue heron stood in the shallows. It looked too large for such a modest place. All folded neck, blade beak, ash blue body, and patient legs. It did not hunt at first. It simply waited, motionless enough that the landscape seemed to have made it from its own silence. Ruby watched the bird for nearly an hour. Once it lifted one foot and set it down again without disturbing the water. Once it struck, quick and exact, then resumed its stillness as if nothing had happened. Ruby did no work that day. She did not make that failure into a sermon. She did not punish herself by working after dark. She returned at noon, ate rice, fed the stove, and sat on the newly oiled floor with her back against the counter. Her body had asked for one day of not becoming useful. She gave it the day. The next morning, she rose before dawn and swept the floor lightly, as if greeting someone who had waited without accusation. February entered through the windows before it entered the calendar. The roof no longer admitted weather from above, and the chimney carried smoke away, but the windows let cold move through the room in thin, deliberate streams. There were 8 in all, 2 across the front, 3 along the cutting-room wall, 1 above the silver bench, 1 small window in the rear door, and 1 narrow original pane high on the west side that Henry said might be older than the rest of the structure. 3 had no glass at all, only cardboard, cloth, and 1 license plate nailed badly over the openings. 4 were cracked. The last, the narrow west pane, was wavy glass with bubbles and a faint green edge when light struck it. Ruby wanted to replace nothing that could still do its work. Henry examined her sketch and tapped the west window with the pencil. "That one stays." "I thought so. Could be from the first building. Maybe 1888. Maybe earlier glass moved from somewhere else. You do not throw away a pane that has seen more weather than your family." So she repaired around it. The work began with removing old glazing. The putty had hardened to stone in some sashes and turned to chalk in others. Ruby softened what she could with careful heat from a borrowed lamp, then worked a putty knife along the rabbets, lifting cracked strips without gouging the wood. Glazier's points came out one by one, tiny triangles of metal rusted thin as old leaves. Each pane was removed, washed, dried, and laid on folded cloth. The 3 empty windows received salvaged glass from a cabinet Henry kept in the storage room, panes collected from remodels, storm doors, and buildings that had not been allowed to stay. None fit perfectly. Ruby measured twice, marked with a grease pencil, and watched Henry score the glass with a cutter whose wheel made a sound like a zipper on ice. "You do the next," he said. Her first score wandered near the end. Henry looked at it. "Glass follows doubt." She tried again. By the 4th pane, the score ran clean. Back at the workshop, Ruby repaired the sashes before setting glass. Loose joints were pinned with small brads. Rotten corners were consolidated with patience more than confidence. One lower rail had to be patched with a piece of old pine cut from a broken drawer back, its grain close enough to belong after paint. She replaced sash cord in 2 front windows where the weights had fallen and the windows refused to stay open. The cord was 1/4-inch cotton, not nylon, because Henry said nylon had no manners in old windows. Ruby fed it over the pulley, tied a figure-8 knot at the counterweight, and listened for the weight's hidden descent inside the wall pocket. The first time, the knot slipped. The weight dropped with a thud inside the cavity, and Ruby stood very still, eyes closed. Then she opened the pocket and did it again. The DAP 33 glazing putty came in a squat can with a lid that fought removal. It smelled oily, mineral, and faintly sweet. Henry had told her to knead it until it warmed in her hand, roll it into a rope, bed the glass gently, press points in flat, then tool the outside bevel in one smooth line if she could. The bevel had to shed water. Beauty mattered less than slope, though after enough practice the two began to resemble each other. Her first line was lumpy. Her second was less so. By the 5th window, the putty knife moved with a steadiness that surprised her. She held it at an angle, drew it along the sash, removed the excess cleanly, and left a bevel that caught the light like a narrow cream-colored ribbon. She did not hurry the corners. Corners revealed impatience. The cracked panes she saved when she could. A crack in the upper corner of the silver bench window was stopped with a small drilled point and sealed until spring. One front pane had a long diagonal split and could not be trusted against wind. She replaced it near sunset, while the road outside turned blue and the walnut trees wrote their branches across the glass. The last window was the narrow west pane. She did not remove it. She repaired the sash in place, scraping old putty with the delicacy of cleaning around a wound. The glass wavered when she touched the frame, and through it the world appeared softened, bent slightly, made older by the looking. She bedded new putty around it with the smallest knife, pressing just enough, never enough to force. Outside, on the walnut branch nearest the wall, a chickadee landed. It was so close that Ruby could see the black cap, the white cheek, the small claws closing around the twig. The bird tipped its head and looked through the imperfect glass into the room where the stove warmed. The oiled floor and the counter held a tin box, a walnut twig, a folded letter, and a day's worth of tools set in order. Ruby stopped moving. The chickadee flicked its tail once, then picked at something invisible along the bark. It did not know about condemned buildings, county stamps, lost stones, hidden money, or women learning to rebuild what had been left to weather. It knew February light, bark, hunger, and the next small movement. After a moment, Ruby returned to the putty. She finished the bevel in one line. Not flawless. True enough. By evening, all 8 windows held against the wind. 3 with salvaged panes. 4 with repaired cracks or replacements. 1 with its old wavy glass kept in place, looking west through everything it had survived. Ruby stood in the front room after dark and listened. The stove drew. The roof held. The chimney breathed. The floor carried her without complaint. The windows did not rattle as they had before. Outside, winter pressed its face to the glass, but the room no longer opened itself to every passing cold. The workshop was patient. So was she. Late February showed Ruby where the walls had been holding their breath. The workshop's plaster had survived more than she expected. Beneath the smoke film, dust, water stains, and hairline cracks. The walls were not drywall, not modern board pretending to be wall, but horsehair plaster over hand-split oak lath, original in the front room and carried into the earliest part of the cutting room. Henry proved it by tapping with his knuckle and then by showing her the broken place near the chimney, where pale plaster had failed in 3 patches and revealed thin wooden strips beneath, each one split by hand rather than sawn, with gaps between them just wide enough for plaster keys. "You keep this," he said. Ruby looked at the jagged opening. The powder at the baseboard, the 3 failed areas where damp and heat had loosened the surface. "I do not know how yet." He brought from the hardware storage room an old paper sack of horsehair, tied with twine and dated in pencil sometime in the 1950s. It had belonged, he said, to his father's shop inventory, back when people still patched walls instead of covering them. The hair smelled faintly of barn, dust, and the past. Ruby accepted it without smiling too broadly, because Henry disliked gratitude that took up more room than necessary. The mix required attention. Lime putty, clean sand, chopped horsehair, and water in proportions that could be written down but still had to be judged by hand. Henry explained it twice over the counter, then made Ruby repeat it with her own words. The scratch coat needed enough hair to bind and grip the lath. The brown coat needed body, roughly 3/8 of an inch, pressed firm and left 72 hours if the room stayed cold. The finished coat would be thin, 1/8 at most, smoother but not polished into false perfection. "Old walls do not need vanity," he said. "They need keys." Ruby began by cutting the failed plaster back to sound edges with a utility knife and a small chisel, resisting the urge to widen damage beyond its truth. She vacuumed dust with a borrowed hand pump cleaner so old she had to empty it every few minutes. Then she misted the lath. Dry wood drank too quickly. Henry had warned, and stolen moisture made weak plaster. The scratch coat was humbling. She pressed the hairy lime mix into the gaps, forcing it between the lath strips until it bulged behind them and made keys on the far side. Then she scored the face with horizontal lines using a notched scrap of wood, giving the next coat something to grip. Her first patch slumped at one corner. She removed it, mixed stiffer, and tried again. The plaster did not forgive pride, but it accepted correction. For 3 days the room smelled of lime and damp mineral. Ruby kept the stove low and steady, not hot enough to dry the plaster too fast. She turned the repaired areas into small weather reports. touching near them but not on them, watching color shift from wet gray to pale cream. When the brown coat went on, it filled the patch nearly to the old wall plane. She used a straight board to level it, then left it alone, though every impatient part of her wanted to smooth and fuss. 72 hours. She waited. Waiting had become less empty with practice. While the plaster cured, she sharpened the borrowed putty knives, cleaned the silver bench drawers, sorted grit papers, and wrote down every debt in a notebook. Medina hardware, Abel's unpriced labor, Doris's onions and paper bags, the borrowed ladder, the roofing hatchet still hanging near the door until returned. Beside each debt she wrote not only money, but the form in which repayment might be accepted. Repair, candles, labor, quiet usefulness. She was learning that accounts could hold more than numbers. The finish coat went on under a blue morning sky. Ruby mixed it fine, worked it thin, and feathered it into the old plaster with the broadest knife she owned. She did not try to erase the boundaries completely. The patches would be visible to someone who knew where to look, slightly smoother in the middle, slightly paler, with the faintest line where old and new met. That seemed right. A repair that lied about damage was only another kind of damage. By evening, the 3 patches near the chimney had settled into the wall. Ruby stood with one hand on the mantel shelf, looking at them in the stove light. The room was still rough. The baseboards needed scraping. Paint had lifted in scales near the door. But the wall no longer crumbled when the wind shook the chimney. It held. "These patches will hold another 100 years," she said. The sentence entered the room quietly and stayed there. Doris ran Marisol's cafe as if it were a kitchen table made public by necessity. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her late 50s with copper-colored hair pinned in a hurried knot, reading glasses on a chain, and hands that smelled of green chile, dish soap, and cinnamon. Her cafe opened before sunrise for road crews, teachers, and old men who believed coffee should be refilled before the cup admitted emptiness. Ruby had avoided the place at first because Mrs. Quintana's suggestion had made need feel visible, but hunger and winter eventually made avoidance foolish. The first time Ruby entered, Doris did not ask for a story. She pointed to a stool near the end of the counter and set down yesterday's roll warmed on the grill with butter. "That one broke," she said. It had not broken. Ruby ate it with both hands around the plate. After that, paper bags began appearing on the workshop doorstep every few days. Always early, always before Ruby heard a car. Inside were things Doris could dismiss as unsuitable: rolls too dry for sale, soup ends in a jar, carrots bent strangely, tortillas from a package opened by mistake, coffee grounds enough for 1 pot. Once there was a slice of apple pie wrapped in wax paper, its crust cracked along one edge. On the bag Doris had written, "Too ugly for customers." Ruby walked to the cafe that afternoon with money folded in her pocket. Doris was wiping the counter. "I need to pay you." "I can pay some. In candles when the shop reopens." Ruby paused. "I do not make candles." "You have beeswax in that place." "I expect." "Every old shop has something." "Or you will learn." "I need 2 for the window by Easter." That settled it, in Doris's mind. She turned away to refill coffee for a man in a denim jacket, and Ruby understood she had been given not charity, but a future task. Doris did that for people. She carried mercy in forms that could be repaid by the living, if not by the same measure. A bag of rolls became 2 candles. A jar of soup became an errand. A warm stool became the expectation that a person might one day sit there by choice. Caleb arrived with an axe over his shoulder and suspicion in every bone. He was 16, maybe 17, long-limbed and narrow, with black hair that fell over one eye, a coat too thin for splitting weather, and a red Schwinn bicycle he rode even through slush. The bicycle had chrome fenders, one bent pedal, and a playing card clipped to the back wheel that snapped when he rode fast. Ruby first saw him leaning the bike against the walnut tree while she was sorting scrap wood into burnable and useless piles. "My mother said you need splitting," he said. Ruby looked at the axe. "Who is your Mrs. Quintana?" That explained the posture. He had inherited her exactness, but not yet her control over it. "I can split some." He glanced at the pile. "Not enough." Before she could answer, he set a round of wood on the chopping block, lifted the maul, and brought it down with a clean strike that opened the round along a hidden line. He was not large, but he knew how to let the tool fall. He worked for 40 minutes without speaking, breath white, sleeves pushed up despite the cold. Ruby stacked what he split under the porch roof, keeping bark side up the way Abel had shown her. When she offered money, Caleb shook his head. "My mother said." "About your grandfather." "He was not exactly my grandfather." Caleb set another round upright. "She said he was enough." The words landed with the plain force of something repeated from an adult but not diminished by that repetition. Ruby did not correct him again. Caleb came twice a week after school when weather allowed. He split wood, carried water when the hand pump still failed, and once crawled under the porch to retrieve a dropped sash weight because he was the only one narrow enough to reach it. He refused food at first, then accepted tortillas if Ruby put them on the step and went inside. Pride recognized pride, even when it wore a teenager's face. By March, he had begun asking questions about the machines. Not many. Never too directly. "What's that wheel for?" "Polishing." "What's the big saw cut?" "Stone too large for the trim saw." "Can it cut bone?" "No." He nodded, perhaps disappointed, perhaps relieved. Reverend Boyd did not enter the workshop all winter. He walked past every morning at nearly the same hour, a tall black man in his 70s with a charcoal overcoat, polished shoes unsuited to muddy edges, and a hat he tipped without fail. His church stood nearer town, but someone told Ruby he had taken to walking the North Road after his wife died because she had liked the walnut trees. Whether that was true did not matter as much as the fact that he moved like someone keeping an appointment. The first week, he tipped his hat and continued. The second, he said, "Morning, Miss Vega." Ruby answered from the porch, hammer in hand. "Morning, Reverend." She did not know how he knew her name. In Taos, names appeared to travel by weather. On the coldest mornings, when frost silvered the ditch and the road rang under footsteps, he paused by the low wall, never crossing unless invited. He would look at the roof work, the chimney patch, the windows in progress, and nod once. His prayers, if they were prayers, were not speeches. He did not lay hands on the door or ask her to bow her head. He only tipped his hat and said 4 words as he passed. "Lord, keep this house." That was all. The first time he said it, Ruby stood very still on the porch with a bucket of plaster in her hands. The phrase did not sound like ownership, not in his mouth. It sounded like shelter being requested from a larger weather than the sky. He kept walking, shoes dark against snow, coat hem moving at his knees. After that, Ruby expected the words without depending on them. Some mornings he said nothing, only lifted his hand. Some mornings wind took the words before they reached her. But the shape of them remained. "Lord, keep this house." 4 words passing over a condemned building. A mended roof. A repaired chimney. A young woman with ash beneath her nails. And all the dead whose work had not quite been finished. The seller waited until February 11. Ruby had postponed it for reasons both practical and not. Practical. Because the roof, chimney, floors, windows, and plaster had been more urgent. Not practical, because cellars were where abandoned buildings kept their oldest breath, and she had learned not to open the deepest places until the upper rooms could receive what came out of them. The door was in the back room beneath a workbench, half hidden by a warped sheet of plywood and 2 crates of broken belts. It lay flat in the floor, made of thick planks with an iron ring set into the center. The ring lifted after oil and effort. The door rose on strap hinges that complained loudly, releasing a smell of damp stone, earth, mouse nests, and cold mineral dark. Ruby stood above the opening with the flashlight in one hand and Henry's dust mask in the other. 7 granite steps led down, each worn in the middle by feet that had gone below for jars, roots, stored stone, or refuge from summer heat. The walls were fieldstone laid with lime, irregular but sound, and the floor below measured roughly 12 by 15 feet. She counted with her steps, heel to toe, then wrote the dimensions in her notebook because writing made the dark less vague. The cellar was not full. That surprised her. She had expected collapsed shelves, broken jars, perhaps water. Instead, she found emptiness arranged around a center point. Along one wall stood 2 shelves holding canning jars with rusted lids and nothing inside but dust. In another corner lay a stack of slate pieces. A wooden barrel had collapsed into itself near the far wall. Mouse droppings marked the edges, but there was no standing water, no rot deep enough to threaten the floor above. At the center of the cellar sat a single dressed granite slab. It was too deliberate to be ordinary. 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, several inches thick, set into the floor as if marking a place or closing one. Its surface had been smoothed but not polished, and at one end was carved a small craft mark, a circle crossed by a short line and 3 dots arranged like stones in a setting. Ruby brushed dust from it with her sleeve. The carving held shadow. She did not lift the slab. Everything in her winter had taught her the difference between discovery and disturbance. A hidden place did not become hers simply because she found it. The slab was too heavy for one person. And more importantly, it was too intentional. She placed her palm flat on the granite once, feeling the cold enter her skin, then stood and left it as it was. The fine came on the stairs going up. Her shoulder brushed the underside of the 3rd step, and something shifted. A dry scrape, wood against stone. Ruby turned the flashlight upward. Wedged beneath the 3rd granite tread, supported by 2 old nails and a sliver of oak, was a small box no larger than a loaf of bread. It had been hidden from below, not above, where a person descending would never see it. The box was oak, darkened by damp but not rotted, with a sliding lid swollen tight. She carried it upstairs before opening it. Some things did not belong in the cellar air longer than necessary. On the front counter, in daylight, she worked the lid loose with a thin knife. Inside lay a brass key and a tintype photograph. The key was not large. Its shaft was plain, but the bow had been shaped by hand into the same craft mark carved on the granite slab, a circle, a short bar, and 3 small raised beads like stones waiting in a setting. The brass had gone dark except where the high points had rubbed against cloth. Ruby lifted it and felt its weight. It was heavier than it looked. The photograph was wrapped in tissue, brittle at the folds, Ruby opened it and drew in a breath so quietly the room barely heard. A young woman stood in front of this cottage when the porch roof had been straight and the sign newly painted. She was about Ruby's age, perhaps a little older, with dark hair parted at the center and pinned back, wearing a long skirt, a white blouse, and an apron dusted at the front. In her right hand she held a stone dopstick. In her left, a silver hammer. Her expression was serious, not stern, and she looked directly toward the camera as if the act of being seen required steadiness. Her face was Ruby's face, rearranged by time. Not exactly, not impossibly, but near enough that Ruby sat down. The same brow, the same mouth when not smiling, the same deep-set eyes that made strangers think she was calmer than she felt. The resemblance did not flatter. It claimed. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, was written, Lucia Magdalena Salazar, daughter of Esteban, age 25, summer of 1903. Ruby placed the photograph beside Magdalena's letter and then beside the older photograph from the tin box. 3 women and men, 3 times, 1 place, 1 trade moving in and out of silence. The young woman in the tintype held the tool not like a prop, but like a continuation of her own hand. The brass key had no known lock. Ruby tried it nowhere that day. Not the front door, not the drawers, not the cellar door, not the cabinet with the false back. It did not feel lost. It felt early. She set it on the mantel, where stovelight touched its raised beads each evening and made them glow briefly before dark took them back. From then on, when she passed the cellar door, she remembered the granite slab and left it alone. There were enough mysteries for winter. Spring did not arrive as a declaration. It came by retreat. Snow drew back from the south side of the wall. Ice thinned along the irrigation ditch, then broke overnight into small plates that gathered against stones and vanished by noon. The creek beyond the low wet place grew loud with snowmelt, speaking over itself in a language of thaw. Walnut catkins appeared, first tight and dark, then loosened into greenish tassels that moved in the slightest wind. Mud replaced ice in the ruts. The road softened. The air began to smell of wet earth instead of metal. By March, Ruby could walk to town without keeping her shoulders raised against cold. The hand pump behind the workshop gave its first true water on March 9. It came brown at first, then cloudy, then clear enough to fill a bucket for washing floors, but not yet clear enough to drink. Ruby shouted once when the pump caught, then looked around as if the walnut trees might disapprove of noise. No one heard except a raven, which lifted from the wall and complained on its way north. The county inspector came in late March. Mrs. Quintana had warned Ruby he would. He arrived in a white truck with mud on the tires, a clipboard, and the expression of a man accustomed to disappointing people. He checked the roof, chimney, windows, floor, stove clearance, rear wall, and cellar stairs. He did not praise. He did not threaten. He wrote for nearly 20 minutes, then tore off a yellow copy and handed it to Ruby. Demolition hold extended, he said. 90 days. Keep going. Ruby folded the paper and placed it in the tin box, not beside the letter, but beneath it. She had thought often about beginning the craft. The machines were still not ready. The trim saw needed belts and a blade. The slab saw needed cleaning beyond what she had done, new oil, electrical evaluation, and more confidence than spring had yet given her. The silver bench could be made workable sooner. But even there, fuel, ventilation, and tools had to be brought back in order. Ruby could have spent from the hidden money and rushed the reopening of what the sign promised. She did not. She spent 3 coins instead. Not rare ones. Not from the muslin bag. From ordinary change earned by sweeping Doris's back room, stacking boxes for Henry, and repairing a broken glass for Mrs. Quintana, using borrowed pliers and a care that made the clerk look away for a moment. With 1 coin she ordered a small packet of low-grade practice stones from a supplier Henry trusted. With another she bought sandpaper sheets. With the third she purchased a little beeswax for dop experiments, because the old wax had hardened past use. The turquoise remained wrapped. It was not fear that kept her from cutting it. Fear had been louder in December. By spring, the restraint was something else. Respect, perhaps. Or sequence. A person did not begin with the finest stone simply because it had appeared in her life. She would practice on agate, jasper, and broken scraps. She would learn what her hands remembered and what they did not. She would ruin cheap pieces before touching the blue ones Magdalena had hidden. On April mornings, Ruby opened the front door and let air move through the rooms. Dust still rose, but less of it. Light came through repaired glass and touched the oiled floor, the plaster patches, the counter, the mantel key, and the old sign visible through the window. Caleb's split wood had become a neat stack by the stove. Doris's candle request sat on the counter in the form of 2 uneven beeswax tapers Ruby had rolled and re-rolled until they stood straight enough. Reverend Boyd still passed most mornings, sometimes with a sprig of something green in his lapel. One afternoon, Ruby carried the leather roll of gravers to the silver bench and opened it. She did not use them. She only cleaned the handles with a soft cloth and placed them in order. Flat. Onglet, lining tool, scorper, burnisher, scribe. The tools lay in a row under the window, and the chickadee came back to the walnut branch as if inspecting the arrangement. Ruby smiled then, briefly and to herself, but her hands stayed busy. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Ruby finished the first piece worthy of the old sign. It was not large. It was not made from the finest turquoise, nor from silver heavy enough to call attention to itself. It was a modest pendant, cut from a piece of Royston too fractured for sale in its rough state and too lovely to discard. She had studied the stone for 3 evenings before marking it, turning it under the lamp, wetting it with 1 fingertip, letting the matrix show where the shape wanted to be. In the end, it became a long oval, slightly irregular, blue-green at the center with brown host rock crossing one lower edge like a winter road. The cabochon took 4 days. She cut slowly on the restored trim saw, not the slab saw, which she now used only when necessary and never without remembering what it had kept. She doped the stone with her own wax mixture, warmed until soft and no hotter, then shaped the dome through grits she had written on a card above the wheel. 220, 400, 600, 1200, 3000. She stopped between each stage, rinsed, dried, and looked under the strong lamp for scratches that wanted to hide until polish made them permanent. No grit forgives what the one before it refused to remove. Magdalena's sentence lived on the wall now, copied by Ruby's hand on a small card stained at one corner by coffee. For the setting, she used sterling sheet purchased with earned money, not hidden money. She cut the bezel, annealed it to a dull red, pickled it warm, shaped it around the stone, and soldered it to the backplate with medium solder, breathing steadily as the flux went glassy and the silver flashed. Her hands were no longer the hands that had opened the workshop door. They were scarred in small places, steadier, darker at the nails, less apologetic in their work. When the stone finally seated, when the burnisher closed the bezel lip around it in a slow, bright line, Ruby set the pendant on the counter and did not touch it again for an hour. Outside, snow fell without wind. Inside, the restored room received it as light. The workshop by then had become neither museum nor polished shopfront. It remained hand-worn, with its history visible where it did not endanger the living. The front room held the counter, repaired display case, poppelied stove, 2 straight-back chairs, a ledger desk, and shelves labeled in Ruby's careful hand. The floor had deepened under use, its oiled pine carrying marks from boots, chair feet, dropped tools, and one crescent-shaped burn near the stove where a coal had escaped. She had left the mark. It belonged to the winter that taught her fire. The plaster patches near the chimney had cured to a gentle cream, their edges visible only in low light. The west window still held its wavy glass. On certain evenings, the whole road bent slightly through it, and Ruby liked that. The cutting room had been cleaned, rewired by a licensed electrician recommended by Henry, and arranged by function. Rough stone shelf, trim saw, slab saw, grinding station, polishing wheel, silver bench, washing basin, finished work drawer. Each tool had a place, not because she feared disorder, but because exact work deserved not to waste a morning searching. She was 22 and frozen. No coat worth naming, no address, no one waiting. Just her father's canvas field pouch and $10 she had kept folded inside a bus schedule since the night the locks were changed. And with that $10, she bought a lapidary workshop, weather-split and dust-choked, on the north edge of Taos in Taos County. New Mexico, a place that had fallen off county maps in 1987. One back wall bowed outward like a tired rib. The roof leaked through 3 seams above the cutting room. The county had condemned it since 2009 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the oil-cooling reservoir of the cast-iron slab saw, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 30 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Ruby Marisol Vega had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. She had waited in doorways as a child, one hand on the warm metal knob, listening for the particular sound of peace in a house. Not laughter. Exactly. Laughter could turn sharp if somebody had been drinking, or if a bill came in the mail, or if her older sister found some new reason to look at Ruby as if she were a thing set down in the wrong room. Ruby listened instead for the calm between sounds, the scrape of a chair being pulled out carefully, the low clink of a spoon against a pot, her father humming with his mouth closed while he sorted rough stones on the kitchen table. They lived then in a narrow rental outside Espanola, where the winter light came in pale and sideways through aluminum-framed windows, and the chamisa bent silver in the wind. The house smelled of cumin, solder smoke, coffee gone bitter on the burner, and the faint mineral scent that followed her father home from job sites and trade fairs. He was not a jeweler in the way glossy magazines used the word. He made practical silver bracelets for tourists, repaired broken squash blossom necklaces, cut cabochons when somebody brought him decent turquoise, and accepted cash, food, or firewood depending on the season. Ruby learned early that money was not the first measure of a thing. A clasp could be honest or weak. Stone could be dyed or true. A person could smile and still be careless with what another person had made. Her mother, Elena, worked the early shift at a motel laundry, where sheets rolled through machines hot enough to raise steam in winter. She came home with red hands, folded herself into a chair, and took off her shoes without a word. In Ruby's youngest memory, her mother's hands were always doing something that looked like care. Folding, rinsing, plaiting hair, pressing a washcloth over a feverish forehead. But there was a part of Elena that had stepped backward long ago and never quite returned, as if some door inside her had closed softly and she had decided not to trouble the household by mentioning it. Ruby's father, Marisol Vega, was different. He could enter a room and lower the weather in it. He was not loud, and he had the sort of patience that made a child believe the world might be repaired if one only set the pieces in order. His hands were broad and dark from sun, his thumbnail on the right side flattened from a hammer strike years before, and he wore magnifying lenses on a cord around his neck like another man might wear a cross. On Saturdays, he took Ruby with him to his mother's place near Trucius, where the mountains rose blue and severe beyond the Pinon. Her grandmother had died before Ruby was old enough to remember her, but her father's uncle still lived there in a two-room, adobe house with a corrugated tin roof, a cold spring, and a shed full of wheels, belts, grit, and stones wrapped in newspaper. His name was Ignacio Salazar, though everyone in the family called him Tio Nacho. He was not truly an uncle by blood in the neat way people drew trees on paper. He was a cousin, a widower, a godfather, a keeper of stories, and one of the last men in that part of the county who could look at a rough stone and tell where its best face was hiding. He had a silver beard that grew in two directions, a left eye clouded by cataract, and fingers so steady they seemed borrowed from a younger man. Ruby's weekend ritual began before sunrise. Mateo would wake her while the house still held the night, and he would lay 2 flour tortillas wrapped in a cloth beside her on the truck seat. The road north was dark except for the faint lamps of gas stations and the slow gold line growing behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Ruby would press her forehead to the cold window and watch fences, cottonwoods, and sleeping fields pass in gray pieces. By the time they reached Tio Nacho's shed, the first light would be touching the workbench. He kept the place orderly, though it did not look orderly to anyone who did not understand his method. Coffee cans held DOP sticks. Baby food jars held cerium oxide, tin oxide, and worn diamond burrs. Strips of leather hung from nails. A basin of cloudy water stood near the trim saw, and beside it lay a rag folded as carefully as a church linen. Against the far wall sat the heavy slab saw that had once belonged to a Taos cutter, its cast-iron frame painted a green so aged it had become almost black. Ruby was small enough then to believe machines had tempers. The slab saw seemed to her the most patient and dangerous thing in the room. It did not chatter like the trim saw or whine like the polishing wheel. It waited with a round blade half hidden under its guard, smelling of oil, metal, and stone dust. Tio Nacho never let her touch it without both his hands over hers. Stone does not forgive a hurried hand, he told her one morning. He said it without drama, while guiding a piece of jasper toward the blade, the water and oil sliding over the cut in a gray shining thread. Ruby remembered that sentence because it did not seem to be only about stone. It was about eggs in a pan, stitches in a hem, a frightened animal, a sick parent, a person who had been wounded and would not say where. A hurried hand broke what a careful hand might reveal. After cutting, there was shaping. After shaping, sanding. After sanding, the long, slow polish that made Ruby impatient until she began to understand the work was not decoration but discovery. A stone could be dull for hours, stubborn for days, and then one morning under the wheel it would open into blue-green water. Red desert, milk cloud, black mountain, or a white line fine as breath. Tio Nacho taught her to use a light touch and to keep her thumbs away from the wheel. He taught her to feel heat through the dop stick before the stone cracked. He taught her that turquoise needed respect, because soft beauty could be easier to ruin than hardness. At noon, they ate beans from a pot and tortillas warmed on the stove. Mateo and Tio Nacho spoke in a mixture of English and Spanish, the talk moving from roof repairs to silver prices to old families who had gone to Albuquerque or Phoenix and never come back. Ruby sat between them, drinking weak coffee with too much milk, watching dust move in the square of sunlight by the door. Those Saturdays were the first home she ever trusted. Then Mateo got sick in a way that did not announce itself all at once. He started losing weight. He sat down more often. His cough stayed after winter passed, and the lenses around his neck began resting against a chest that looked less and less able to hold breath. He kept working until the day his hand slipped while he was setting a bezel and the stone popped free, rolled across the table, and disappeared under the stove. By summer, he could no longer drive north. Tio Nacho came instead, in an old brown pickup with a cracked windshield, bringing small parcels wrapped in butcher paper. He would sit at Mateo's bedside and talk about nothing heavy. Weather, the price of propane, a woman in Taos who wanted old silver melted into new rings. Sometimes he opened one parcel and placed a stone in Mateo's palm, and the two men would study it as if the entire earth had been reduced to that single rough piece. Mateo died in October. When Ruby was 15, on a morning cold enough to frost the inside corners of the windows. There were casseroles for 3 days, murmured prayers, black clothes borrowed from neighbors, and then the ordinary cruelty of time returning with its lists and due dates. Elena stopped saying Mateo's name except when paperwork required it. Ruby's sister, Celeste, 17 then and already beautiful in a sharp, costly way, began wearing Mateo's silver rings as if grief were something that could be displayed and traded. Tio Nacho tried to keep the Saturdays alive. For almost 2 years, he came for Ruby twice a month and took her to the shed, where he had set aside a drawer for the things he said belonged to her hands. Her father's dop pot, a set of worn files, 3 pieces of Sleeping Beauty turquoise, 2 pieces of Royston ribbon, a cigar box filled with cabochons Mateo had cut and never sold, a little leather roll of gravers, silver black from age, a notebook with Mateo's measurements in pencil, written so exactly that Ruby could hear him breathing between the numbers. When Tio Nacho died of a stroke 2 weeks after Ruby turned 18, the drawer disappeared before the funeral ham was cold. No one admitted moving it. No one had seen the cigar box. No one knew where the leather roll had gone. Celeste shrugged in the kitchen, wearing lipstick the color of dried cherries, and said maybe old men threw things away without telling anyone. Elena stood by the sink with her hands in soapy water and did not lift her eyes. Ruby looked for those things for months. In closets, in the carport, behind sacks of winter clothes, under Celeste's bed when Celeste was gone, though she hated herself for it. She found pawn tickets once, folded inside a magazine, but the names were smudged by spilled soda and the dates had passed. By then the stones, if they were her father's, had gone into somebody else's tray, somebody else's ring, somebody else's careless story about where beautiful things came from. After that, the house changed its sound. Celeste grew restless in the way of someone who believed life had cheated her before she had been asked to do much with it. She had inherited Mateo's fine cheekbones, but none of his restraint. She could be tender with strangers and exacting at home, especially with Ruby, who worked at a grocery deli, took night classes when she could, and kept her paychecks in a bank envelope taped under a dresser drawer. Celeste borrowed first. Then she demanded. Then she took and made silence around the taking. daring anyone to name it. There were men who came and went. Not violent men, not men who broke furniture, but men who brought a dry chemical smell into the hallway and left the bathroom mirror dusted with a powder Ruby wiped away using toilet paper wrapped around her fingers. There were weeks when Celeste slept all day, and then moved through the house at 3 a.m. opening cabinets. There were apologies that arrived with tears and disappeared before rent was due. There were promises made on Mateo's grave, spoken with one hand pressed against Celeste's chest, as if the shape of sorrow could be borrowed for persuasion. Ruby learned not to argue. Arguing only made Elena fold smaller into herself. Ruby learned to hide money in different places and then learned that hiding was not enough. She learned which pawnshops asked for identification and which ones did not. She learned that a family could become a hallway where everyone passed one another carefully, carrying breakable things that had already cracked. The final winter came lean. The motel where Elena worked changed owners. Ruby's hours at the deli were cut after Thanksgiving. Celeste vanished for 6 days and returned with a bruise yellowing along her jaw, 3 plastic bags of clothes Ruby had never seen, and a smile too bright to be trusted. By then the rent was behind, and notices had begun appearing under the door in envelopes with red print. Ruby paid what she could. She sold her winter boots and wore thrift store shoes with cardboard inside. She stopped buying coffee. She carried a thermos of hot water and called it enough. On December 6, the landlord came before noon. He was a square man with kind eyes he had trained not to use. Ruby remembered that because he held the eviction packet in both hands, as though it were something hot, and because a snow flurry had started behind him, thin and dry, blowing sideways across the gravel lot. The object she kept seeing afterward was not the paper, not the lockbox he had brought for the new key, but the blue ceramic bowl on the kitchen table, the one Mateo had used for sorting stones. It sat empty in a square of winter light. Celeste stood by the refrigerator in a red sweater that had cost more than Ruby's weekly groceries. Elena stood beside the stove, wiping the same clean place with a dishcloth. Ruby had a canvas duffel open on the floor. Into it she put 2 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, underwear, her father's field pouch, a toothbrush, the bank envelope with what remained after rent, and a photograph of Mateo and Tio Nacho standing outside the shed, their shoulders touching, both of them squinting into the sun. She reached for the blue ceramic bowl. Celeste's hand closed over it first. "Take what fits. The rest stays with us." 8 words, spoken flatly, without heat. That was the mercy of it and the wound. Celeste did not shout. She did not need to. She had already emptied the drawer, already pawned the stones, already learned that their mother's silence was a room she could use. Ruby looked at Elena. Her mother did not shake her head. She did not nod. She did not say the bowl belonged to Mateo, and therefore to the daughter who had sat beside him, sorting chips of turquoise from dust. She rinsed the dishcloth once more, wrung it carefully over the sink, and hung it on the oven handle as if the small order of that act could excuse the larger disorder. Ruby let go. Outside, the landlord waited beside the steps. He did not rush her. The snow was not enough to cover anything, only enough to make the air visible. When Ruby stepped down with the duffel cutting into her shoulder, he turned his face away in a manner that tried to preserve her dignity and perhaps his own. Behind her, the door closed softly. Then came the sound of the lock changing. She had $143 in cash, a bus pass with 2 rides left, and no address to write on job applications. For 6 weeks, she moved through northern New Mexico like a person trying not to leave footprints. The first 3 nights she slept in the lobby of an all-night laundromat in Española, sitting upright beside dryers that turned and turned, warming other people's blankets. A woman with silver hair and a cowboy sweatshirt let her stay after closing when the wind came hard. But only once, because rules were rules and kindness had to keep its job. Ruby bought a thrift store coat in Santa Fe for $18. It was too wide through the shoulders and missing 2 buttons, but it had deep pockets and smelled faintly of cedar. She slept one night in the chapel vestibule of a hospital, where a nurse placed a cup of broth beside her without asking a question. She slept another night under the covered portal near the palace of the governors, curled behind a stone bench while vendors' tables stood empty around her like patient witnesses. Her money diminished in exact, remembered amounts. $12 for the bus from Espanola to Santa Fe. $3.89 for a pack of tortillas. $7 for second-hand gloves with 1 torn seam. $2.25 for a locker at the transit center until the attendant said she could not keep using it like a room. $5 for a shower at a truck stop outside Bernalillo, where she washed her hair twice and watched gray water run toward the drain as though it were carrying away more than dirt. She went to Albuquerque because cities were supposed to hold opportunities, but the city in January held wind. It came down Central Avenue with grit in it, pushed napkins against chain-link fences, and lifted the edges of cardboard signs. Ruby filled out applications at diners, nursing homes, a discount store, and a warehouse that wanted a permanent address. She wrote her mother's old address once, then crossed it out so hard the paper tore. At night she found places that were almost shelter. A bus station seat beneath a broken vent. A women's shelter cot for 3 nights until the line grew longer than the beds. The back pew of a church during an evening warming program, where volunteers served soup in foam bowls and called everyone honey. The waiting room of a clinic until a security guard touched her shoulder with 2 fingers and said he was sorry. She kept the field pouch under her coat, tied by its strap to her wrist when she slept. Inside were the $10 bill she refused to spend, the photograph, a stub of pencil, and 1 small piece of red jasper Tio Nacho had once given her as practice. It was not valuable. It had a flawed edge and a dull polish, but it fit into the hollow below her thumb as if shaped for that purpose. Sometimes she held it while standing in line, not for luck, but for memory. Memory was steadier. By the 5th week, Ruby had stopped expecting rescue and had begun making terms with the day directly in front of her. She rose before the shelter lights came on. She washed in library bathrooms. She read bulletin boards carefully. She learned which grocery stores marked down bread in the evening and which clerks pretended not to notice when she counted pennies twice. Her coat grew shiny at the cuffs. Her shoes softened dangerously at the soles. The cardboard inside them became damp whenever snowmelt crossed the curb. On a Tuesday morning in Taos, she entered the public library because her fingers had gone numb and because the building had heat. She had reached Taos by taking a ride from a woman delivering medical supplies, then walking the last miles along a road where sagebrush stood dark against the snow. The library was low and warm, with Vegas overhead and children's drawings